They say power can build empires by silence, bury scandals so deep even the worms forget they existed. But there is one thing no title, no fortune, no bloodline can ever purchase: the right to be loved by someone you destroyed. On a frozen night in the English countryside, Duke Cedric Ravenshire discovered that truth the way most powerful men do. Too late. Standing in a room that still smelled like his wife's blood, holding a letter he did not deserve to read. What happens next will change the way you think about loyalty, loss, and the men who confuse ownership with devotion. Stay with this story. Every word earns its place. The physician arrived 90 minutes too late. By the time old Dr. Hargrove's carriage skidded through the ice-crusted gates of Blackthorn Manor, his horse foaming and half dead from the effort, Duchess Evelyn Ashcombe had already delivered a child on sheets that would need to be burned. Margaret Colton, the head maid who had served the estate for 19 years, had caught the baby with hands that would not stop shaking for 3 days afterward. The other servants stood in the doorway of the bedchamber, like mourners at a funeral that had not yet been called, their faces gray with a particular kind of terror that comes from watching a woman nearly die while the man who swore to protect her was somewhere else entirely. The baby was a boy. He weighed almost nothing. Margaret had cleared his airway with her finger, a technique she had seen the physician perform once during a stable-hand's wife's difficult birth 6 years ago. She had rubbed his chest with the heel of her palm, pressing too hard, then not hard enough, then finding a rhythm that was pure desperation masquerading as competence. For 8 seconds that felt like a century, the infant did not breathe. Then he cried. It was not the robust, lung-filling scream of a healthy newborn. It was a thin, reedy sound, like air escaping through a crack in a window pane. But it was life. Margaret wrapped him in a wool blanket that had been warming by the fire and placed him against Evelyn's chest, and the Duchess looked down at her son with the hollow, devastated focus of a woman who understood that she had just performed the most important act of her life completely alone. "He needs milk," Margaret said, her voice carefully controlled, "and warmth, and a physician who arrives before the damage is done. Where is my husband?" It was not a question. Evelyn's voice carried no inflection, no rise at the end, nothing that suggested she expected or even wanted an answer. She asked it the way a person states the weather, flat, resigned, already knowing. Margaret hesitated. She was 51 years old and had spent her entire adult life navigating the unspoken rules of aristocratic households, and the most important of those rules was this: you do not tell the Duchess where the Duke spends his nights. You do not confirm what she already suspects. You do not acknowledge the carriages that leave after dark, or the perfume that clings to his coat when he returns at dawn. You smile. You curtsy. You pretend that the cracks in the foundation are decorative. "I'll send Thomas to fetch him, Your Grace." "Don't." The word landed like a slap. Margaret flinched. Evelyn adjusted the baby against her breast, wincing at the movement. Blood had soaked through the mattress and was dripping onto the floor in a slow, rhythmic pattern that sounded obscene in the silence. She was 26 years old, and in the candlelight she looked 40. Her blonde hair was plastered to her skull with sweat. Her lips were cracked. Her nightgown was ruined beyond salvage. "Don't send for him," she repeated. "I want to remember this night exactly as it is. I want to remember who was here and who was not." Margaret opened her mouth, closed it, and then did something she had never done in 19 years of service. She sat down on the edge of the Duchess's bed without permission and placed her rough, calloused hand over Evelyn's trembling fingers. Neither woman spoke. The baby made his thin, desperate sounds against his mother's chest. The fire crackled. Somewhere deep in the manor, a clock struck 3 in the morning. Dr. Hargrove burst through the door 17 minutes later, snow melting on his shoulders and panic tightening his face into a mask of professional alarm. He took one look at the blood, the baby, the Duchess's pallor, and swore under his breath in a way that confirmed what everyone in the room already knew. "The child came early," he said, pulling instruments from his bag with the practiced speed of a man who had delivered more bad news than good. "How early?" 4 weeks, Margaret answered. "Maybe 5. Her Grace was not certain of the dates. Hargrove examined the infant with gentle, methodical hands. He listened to the tiny chest. He checked the limbs, the reflexes, the color of the skin around the fingernails. He did all of this without speaking, which was worse than any diagnosis he could have offered aloud. "The boy is alive," he finally said. "But he is fragile. The lungs are not fully developed. The next 48 hours will determine whether he survives." "And the Duchess?" Margaret pressed. Hargrove looked at Evelyn, who stared back at him with eyes that dared him to lie. "She has lost a significant amount of blood. She needs rest, complete rest. No movement, no stress, no emotional disturbance of any kind." "Then I suggest," Evelyn said quietly, "that no one tells the Duke about any of this until I decide otherwise." Hargrove's eyebrows rose. In 30 years of practice, he had never heard a wife forbid her husband's presence at the birth of his heir, but something in the Duchess's expression stopped his objection before it formed. There was a quality in her eyes that he recognized from the battlefield. He had served as a field surgeon in his youth. The flat, exhausted clarity of someone who has moved beyond fear into a place where the only thing left is decision. "As you wish, Your Grace." The snow continued to fall. The baby continued to breathe his shallow, uncertain breaths. And 23 miles south, in the lavender-scented bedroom of the Hale country estate, Duke Cedric Ravenshire poured himself another glass of wine and laughed at something Lady Vivienne said about the opera season. He was not thinking about his wife. He had not thought about his wife in any meaningful way for months. This was the architecture of Cedric's betrayal. It was not dramatic. It was not passionate. It was not even particularly interesting. It was the slow, methodical erosion of a marriage by a man who had confused boredom with unhappiness and convenience with love. He had married Evelyn Ashcombe when they were both 22, an arrangement negotiated by their families with the precision of a business merger. She brought connections to the northern textile industry. He brought a title that stretched back to the conquest. On paper, it was flawless. In practice, it was two strangers sharing a house and pretending that shared meals and occasional physical intimacy constituted a life. Evelyn tried. She tried with the kind of relentless, quiet determination that should have broken his heart if he had been paying enough attention to notice. She learned his schedule. She memorized his preferences. She hosted dinners for his political allies and laughed at their terrible jokes and wore the dresses he approved of, and never once, not once in 4 years of marriage, complained about the fact that he treated her like furniture that could also produce an heir. Cedric did not notice because Cedric did not want to notice. Noticing would require acknowledging that his dissatisfaction was not Evelyn's fault. Noticing would require examining the hollow, gnawing emptiness that lived in his chest like a second heartbeat, an emptiness that had been there long before the wedding, long before the title, long before any of it. Noticing would require admitting that he was the problem. So instead, he found Vivienne. Lady Vivienne Hale was 23, the youngest daughter of Baron Hale, and she possessed the single most dangerous quality a woman could have in the proximity of a bored aristocrat. She made him feel interesting. She listened to his opinions about Parliament with wide, attentive eyes. She asked follow-up questions that suggested depth but never actually required it. She laughed at the exact right moments. She made him feel like the version of himself that existed only in his own imagination. Brilliant, magnetic, indispensable. It started with conversations at dinner parties, progressed to private letters, then afternoon visits, then evening visits, then the kind of visits that required drawn curtains and dismissed servants and the careful maintenance of a lie that everyone in society already knew the truth about. "You look troubled tonight," Vivienne said, trailing her fingertips along the rim of her glass. She was wearing a silk robe the color of crushed plums, and her dark hair fell in waves that looked artless but had taken her maid 40 minutes to arrange. "Is it Parliament again?" Parliament is always the answer when a man looks troubled and does not wish to explain the real reason. Then what is the real reason? Cedric considered this. The real reason was a formless anxiety that had settled into his bones 3 days ago and refused to leave. Evelyn's pregnancy was progressing, which meant decisions would need to be made. Rooms would need to be prepared. A nursery organized, a christening planned, all of it requiring him to inhabit the role of husband and father with a sincerity he was not certain he possessed. "There is no real reason," he said. "I am simply a man who has not yet learned how to sit still." Vivienne smiled and moved closer. "Then don't sit still." He kissed her because it was easier than thinking. She kissed him back because she was 23 and believed she was in love with a man who would never love anything as much as he loved his own reflection. Neither of them heard the hoofbeats outside. Neither of them saw Thomas, the Blackthorn footman, ride past the Hale estate at full gallop, heading for the village physician because Margaret had panicked and sent for help despite the Duchess's orders. Neither of them knew that at that exact moment, Evelyn Ashcombe was writing a letter. She wrote it in the narrow window between consciousness and collapse, her hand so unsteady that the words tilted and staggered across the page like drunken soldiers. The baby slept beside her in a makeshift crib fashioned from a drawer lined with blankets. Margaret had gone to heat more water, and for the first time in hours, Evelyn was alone with her thoughts. The thoughts were terrible, clear, precise, and terrible. She had known about Vivienne for months, not because anyone told her. The staff was loyal enough to maintain the fiction, but because Evelyn possessed a quality that Cedric had never bothered to notice. She was observant. She noticed when his cravat smelled of a perfume she did not own. She noticed when his excuses for late nights shifted from parliamentary business to meeting with Lord Ashworth, a man who had been dead for 6 weeks before Cedric remembered to update his alibi. She noticed the way he looked at her during breakfast, not with contempt or even dislike, but with the blank, slightly puzzled expression of a man who could not quite remember why this particular woman was sitting at his table. She dipped the pen in ink. Her hand shook. She wrote. The letter was 4 pages long. She did not plan it. She did not organize her thoughts into neat paragraphs or soften the edges of her pain with diplomatic phrasing. She wrote the way a wound bleeds, without strategy, without restraint, without any consideration for the mess it would leave behind. She wrote about the first year of their marriage, when she still believed that patience could unlock whatever door stood between his body and his heart. She wrote about finding his letters to Vivienne in his study. Not hidden, not even tucked away, just sitting on his desk like correspondence from a tailor, casual and administrative. She wrote about the afternoon she overheard 2 of his friends discussing his mistress in the library, not even lowering their voices because it had not occurred to them that the Duchess might be in the adjacent room. She wrote about the specific, surgical loneliness of sleeping 10 feet from a man who had forgotten she was a person. And then she wrote the line that would haunt Cedric Ravenshire for every remaining day of his life. If our son survives, he will never grow up learning that love looks like abandonment. She folded the letter. She placed it on the nightstand beside the bed. Then she closed her eyes and allowed the darkness to take her. Margaret found her 14 minutes later, unconscious but breathing. Dr. Hargrove was called back. The baby was transferred to a warm room near the kitchen where the cook, a formidable woman named Mrs. Arden, took over his care with the fierce, instinctive competence of a woman who had raised 7 children of her own. The house held its breath. The snow kept falling, and the letter sat on the nightstand, patient and catastrophic, waiting for the man who had earned every word of its devastation. Cedric returned to Blackthorn Manor at 7:30 the following morning. He came through the service entrance, a habit he had developed to avoid the front hall where servants might note the hour, and climbed the back stairs with the casual stealth of a man who had been doing this for so long it no longer felt like deception. The house was wrong. He knew it before he reached the 2nd floor. The quality of the silence was different, charged, pressurized, the kind of quiet that exists in the moments between an explosion and the realization that something has been destroyed. He found Margaret in the hallway outside the master bedroom. She was sitting on a wooden chair that did not belong there, her apron stained with something dark, her hands folded in her lap with deliberate stillness. When she saw the Duke, her expression performed a complicated journey: fury, grief, exhaustion, and finally the practiced blankness of a servant who has decided that her opinion is not worth the consequences. Your Grace, the Duchess gave birth last night. A boy. Both are alive. The words hit Cedric like separate punches. Birth. Last night. Boy. Alive. That is not possible. The child is not due for another month. Babies do not consult calendars, Your Grace. Cedric stared at her. Margaret met his eyes with a steadiness that bordered on insolence, and in that small act of defiance, Cedric understood that this woman knew exactly where he had been. She knew, and she had judged him, and her judgment was the first honest thing he had encountered in months. Where is she? Resting. Dr. Hargrove has forbidden visitors. "I am not a visitor. I am her husband." The word husband fell between them like a counterfeit coin, and Margaret's expression said everything her words could not. But she stepped aside because the hierarchy demanded it, and Cedric pushed open the bedroom door. The smell hit him first. Iron and sweat and something medicinal. Laudanum, perhaps, or the herbal compresses Hargrove favored. The curtains were drawn. A single candle burned on the nightstand. The bed had been stripped and remade with fresh sheets, but the mattress beneath them was stained dark in patterns that would never fully wash out. Evelyn lay on her back, her face turned toward the wall. Her breathing was shallow, rhythmic, the breathing of someone medicated into unconsciousness rather than resting naturally. Her hair had been brushed and braided, Margaret's work, clearly, but her skin was the color of old paper. Cedric stood in the doorway for a long time. He was not a man given to self-reflection, but the room forced a kind of reckoning on him that his mind could not refuse. His wife had nearly died. His child had been born. And he had been drinking wine in another woman's bedroom. He sat down in the chair beside the bed. That was when he saw the letter. It was propped against the candlestick, folded once, his name written on the front in Evelyn's handwriting, but wrong somehow. The letters lurched and stumbled. Some were barely legible. It looked like a message written by someone drowning. He picked it up. He read the first paragraph, then the second. By the third paragraph, his hands were no longer steady. Evelyn's letter did not accuse him. That was what made it unbearable. An accusation he could have deflected, anger he could have dismissed as hysteria, threats he could have countered with legal authority and social leverage. But Evelyn had not given him any of those exits. Instead, she had simply told the truth. She wrote about waiting for him on their first anniversary, wearing the green dress he had once said he liked, only to learn from a servant that he had gone to his club and would not be home for dinner. She wrote about the miscarriage she had suffered 2 years into the marriage, a pregnancy so early that she had not yet told him, and how she had bled alone in the bathroom and cleaned up the evidence herself because she did not want to burden him with grief for a child he had not known existed. She wrote about the night she heard him say Vivian's name in his sleep. She wrote about the morning she woke up and realized she could not remember the last time he had asked her a question, any question, about anything, as if her interior life had simply ceased to be relevant. And then the final line. If our son survives, he will never grow up learning that love looks like abandonment. Cedric set the letter down. He stood up. He walked to the window and pressed his forehead against the glass, and the cold seeped into his skull and did nothing to quiet the noise building inside him, because the noise was not in his head. It was in his chest. A cracking structural sound, like a house settling on a foundation that could no longer hold its weight. He turned back to the bed. Evelyn had not moved. "Where is the child?" he said to the empty room. His voice sounded foreign to him, stripped of the authority and controlled resonance that had characterized his speech for so long it had become indistinguishable from his identity. He found Margaret in the hallway and repeated the question. "The nursery, Your Grace." He climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, where the nursery had been prepared months ago with the efficient, joyless precision of a military installation. Yellow walls, white furniture, a rocking chair that Evelyn had selected from a catalog and placed by the window because she said she wanted to hold the baby and watch the sunset. The room was empty. The crib was there. The rocking chair was there. The small dresser filled with infant clothes was there. But the baby was not. Cedric felt something cold move through his body. It started in his hands and spread upward through his arms and into his chest, a creeping paralysis that he recognized distantly as fear. He found Margaret again. "The nursery is empty. Where's my son?" Margaret's face changed. The professional mask slipped, and beneath it Cedric saw something that made his blood stop moving. "Your Grace, the Duchess. She woke before dawn. She asked for the child. Mrs. Arden brought him to her. And then what?" Margaret swallowed. "And then she left, Your Grace. She dressed herself and took the baby and walked out through the kitchen entrance while the household was still sleeping. By the time we realized she was gone, the carriage tracks were already buried under fresh snow." The silence that followed was absolute. It filled the hallway like floodwater pressing against the walls, finding every crack. "That is not possible," Cedric said. "She cannot have left. She nearly died 12 hours ago. She could barely lift her head." "Desperation gives women strength that physics cannot explain, Your Grace." Where did she go? No one knows. Thomas checked the stables. The small carriage is missing, but the roads are— Your Grace, the roads are buried. We cannot track her in this weather. Cedric grabbed Margaret's arm. His grip was too tight, and she winced, but neither of them acknowledged it. She took my son. She is injured. She is bleeding, and she took a newborn infant into a snowstorm. Find her. With respect, Your Grace, she does not wish to be found. He released her arm. The marks of his fingers would remain visible for 3 days. Cedric descended to his study and poured himself a glass of whiskey. He drank it standing, then he poured another. Then he sat down in his leather chair and stared at the wall and tried to construct a version of the situation in which he was not the villain. He could not. The realization arrived without drama or ceremony. It did not crash over him in a wave of cinematic anguish. It settled into him the way cold settles into stone. Slowly, permanently, without mercy. He had driven his wife away, not with cruelty or violence or any of the spectacular sins that earn a man condemnation in polite society. He had driven her away with something far worse: indifference. He had treated her like a feature of his household rather than a human being. He had yawned through her pain and slept through her loneliness, and carried on as if the woman sharing his name in his bed was a contractual obligation rather than a person who had staked her entire existence on his willingness to care. And now she was gone. And his son was gone. And the house that had once hummed with the quiet domestic energy of a life being built was suddenly, oppressively, catastrophically silent. He finished the whiskey. He called for his head steward, a sharp-eyed man named Whitford, who had managed the estate's affairs for over a decade. Send riders in every direction, offer a reward, contact every inn, every coaching house, every private residence within 50 miles. I want her found. Whitford hesitated. And if she does not wish to return, Your Grace? That is not her decision to make. Whitford studied his employer's face. He had served the Ravenshire family long enough to recognize the difference between authority and desperation. What he saw in the Duke's eyes was not the cold command of a man exercising his rights. It was panic, raw, uncontrolled, humiliating panic. I will dispatch riders immediately, Your Grace. The riders went out. They returned empty-handed. The snow had erased every trace of Evelyn's departure as thoroughly as if she had evaporated. No innkeeper within 60 miles had seen a woman matching her description. No carriage had been spotted on the buried roads. No rumor, no sighting, no whisper. The Duchess of Ravenshire had vanished, and the whispers began. They started in the servants' quarters, migrated to the kitchens of neighboring estates, crossed into the drawing rooms of London society, and within 2 weeks had achieved the unstoppable momentum of genuine scandal. The Duke's wife had fled in the night with his newborn heir. The reason, everyone agreed, was obvious. The Duke's affair with Lady Vivian Hale, which had been London's worst-kept secret for the better part of a year, had finally driven the Duchess past the point of endurance. Cedric watched his reputation disintegrate with the helpless fury of a man watching his house burn while tied to a chair. Parliamentary allies who had once sought his endorsement suddenly found themselves unavailable for meetings. Dinner invitations dried up. Club members exchanged meaningful glances when he entered the room. And Lady Vivian, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure with the instinct of a survivor, quietly withdrew from public life and retreated to her family's country estate, where she composed a letter to Cedric that he never opened. He did not care about Vivian. He understood this now with a clarity that felt like swallowing glass. He had never cared about Vivian. She had been a distraction, a narcotic, a way to avoid sitting in the silence of his marriage and confronting the obvious, terrifying truth, that he was not unhappy because his wife was inadequate. He was unhappy because he was. But understanding this did not bring Evelyn back. Understanding this did not tell him where his son was sleeping tonight, whether the child's lungs had strengthened or whether the fragile body had succumbed to the cold that Evelyn had carried him into. Understanding changed nothing except the texture of his suffering. It became more precise, more surgical, more personally devastating because he could no longer distribute the blame. 3 months passed. Cedric hired investigators. He bribed port officials. He interrogated servants at estates throughout the county. He followed leads that dissolved into dead ends and chased rumors that turned out to be gossip wearing the costume of information. He spent money with the reckless abandon of a man who has discovered that his fortune is useless, hoping that the sheer volume of resources would compensate for the fact that his wife was smarter, more determined, and more motivated than anyone he had ever employed to find her. Because Evelyn had planned this. He understood that now too. The letter was not a farewell written in the delirium of labor. It was a declaration. She had known, perhaps for months, that she would leave. She had arranged things quietly, money, contacts, transportation, with the same meticulous attention to detail that she had once applied to planning his dinner parties. She had simply been waiting for the moment, and the birth of their son in the cold, empty silence of his absence had been the final confirmation she needed. She had looked around that bloody bedroom and seen her future with perfect clarity, and she had decided. On a rain-soaked Tuesday in late March, Cedric's lead investigator, a former military man named Garrett, who had tracked deserters across 3 continents, sent a single-page report to Blackthorn Manor. It contained an address, a small village on the southern coast, 200 miles from London. A woman matching Evelyn's description had been seen purchasing supplies at the local market. She was living in a rented cottage near the harbor. She had a child with her. Cedric read the report 3 times. Then he ordered his carriage. He arrived in the village on a Thursday afternoon after 2 days of travel that left him hollow-eyed and vibrating with an energy that was equal parts hope and dread. The village was small, a cluster of stone buildings arranged around a harbor where fishing boats rocked gently in the gray water. It smelled of salt and wood smoke and a kind of simple, uncomplicated existence that Cedric had never known. He did not announce himself. He left the carriage at the edge of town, instructed his driver to wait, and walked the narrow streets alone, his expensive coat drawing curious glances from fishermen and shopkeepers who had never seen fabric that fine outside of a magazine. He found the cottage. It was modest, whitewashed walls, a blue door, a small garden where herbs grew in defiant clusters despite the salt wind. Smoke rose from the chimney. A line of laundry stretched across the yard. Small clothes, tiny blankets, the mundane artifacts of infant care. Cedric stopped. He stood on the lane outside the cottage for nearly 20 minutes, unable to move. A fisherman passing with his nets gave him a strange look. A dog wandered over, sniffed his boots, and left, unimpressed. Then the door opened. Evelyn stepped out, carrying the baby on her hip. She looked different, not broken, not diminished, not the ghost he had married and the wraith he had abandoned. She looked solid, present, real in a way she had not looked during any of the 4 years she had spent performing the role of his wife. Her hair was loose, her dress was simple, and her face held a color that Blackthorn Manor's expensive rooms had never managed to produce. The baby was healthy. Cedric could see that from 30 yards away. The child was plump and pink and clutching a wooden toy in one fat fist, and when Evelyn whispered something in his ear, he laughed. A full, bursting, uninhibited laugh that carried across the distance and hit Cedric somewhere beneath his ribs. Then a man stepped out of the cottage behind her. He was not aristocratic. He was broad-shouldered and tanned and wore the clothes of a working man, a doctor, perhaps, or a teacher. Someone who used his hands and lived by the rhythm of days that mattered. He placed his hand gently on Evelyn's shoulder, and she leaned into the touch with a naturalness that spoke of weeks, perhaps months, of trust carefully built. The man looked down at the baby and said something that made Evelyn smile. Then he took the child from her arms and lifted him high, and the boy laughed again, reaching for the man's face with both hands, and the man laughed too, and Evelyn watched them both with an expression that Cedric recognized because he had seen it once before, years ago, in the early months of their marriage, when she still believed he might become the man she needed. She had that look now, but it was not directed at him. Cedric stood on that dirt lane in his 1,000-pound coat, and the wind blew off the harbor and carried the sound of his son's laughter toward him. And for the first time in his life, the Duke of Ravenshire understood the actual, specific, irreversible cost of what he had done. He turned around. He walked back to his carriage. He sat in the leather seat and pressed his hands flat against his thighs and stared straight ahead. "Take me home," he told the driver. The driver glanced back at him in the mirror. "Already, Your Grace. You've only just arrived. Take me home." The carriage pulled away. The village shrank behind him. The cottage with its blue door and its laundry line and its laughter grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely, swallowed by distance and the kind of loss that does not diminish with time, but hardens, calcifies, becomes a permanent feature of the landscape inside a man who finally understands that the greatest cruelty is not violence or hatred, but the quiet, devastating, irreversible act of not showing up. The Duke of Ravenshire rode home through the rain with his son's laughter still echoing in his skull, and his wife's letter folded in his breast pocket, pressed against his heart like a wound that would never close. And in the back of his mind, circling like a vulture over carrion, one sentence repeated itself with the relentless patience of a truth that will never expire. If our son survives, he will never grow up learning that love looks like abandonment. The carriage rounded the final bend toward Blackthorn Manor. Through the rain-streaked window, the estate rose against the darkening sky. Massive, immaculate, and utterly empty. Every window was dark, every chimney was cold. The gardens that Evelyn had once tended with her own hands had gone to seed, and the gravel drive was littered with dead leaves that no one had bothered to sweep because no one was expected. Cedric stepped down from the carriage. He stood in the rain and looked up at the house that bore his family's name and held his family's history and contained, as of tonight, exactly one living soul. His. He climbed the steps. He pushed open the front door. The entrance hall stretched before him, cavernous and dark, and his footsteps echoed off marble floors that had once been warmed by the sound of his wife's voice, giving instructions to staff, planning meals, organizing the small, essential rituals that transform a building into a home. He climbed to the third floor. He opened the nursery door. The yellow walls, the white furniture, the rocking chair by the window where Evelyn had planned to hold their son and watch the sunset. Empty. All of it. Empty in a way that went beyond the absence of objects and entered the territory of permanent structural loss. The emptiness of a room that was built for a future that would never arrive. Cedric sat down in the rocking chair. He took out Evelyn's letter. He unfolded it for the 100th time, and the creases were so deep now that the paper was beginning to tear along the fold lines, and he read the words again, all of them, from the first careful sentence to the last devastating line. The rain hit the window. The chair rocked beneath him, and the Duke of Ravenshire sat alone in the nursery of a son he would never raise, holding the letter of a wife he had never deserved, understanding at last that there are destructions so complete, so self-inflicted, so precisely earned, that they do not require an enemy. They only require a man who believed that being powerful was the same as being present. The chair rocked, the rain fell, the letter trembled in his hands. And somewhere on the southern coast, in a small cottage with a blue door, a baby boy laughed in the arms of a man who would never know the weight of the Ravenshire name, and was better for it. The rocking chair had not moved in 6 hours. Cedric sat in the nursery with Evelyn's letter still open across his knees, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the yellow walls, beyond the white furniture, beyond the window where rain had given way to a gray, exhausted dawn that looked exactly the way he felt. His legs were numb. His back ached from the rigid posture he had maintained through the night, spine locked straight, jaw clenched, the physical discipline of a man whose body refused to collapse even after his mind had conceded every battle worth fighting. Margaret knocked at 7. He did not answer. She knocked again at 8. He told her to leave. She returned at 9 with tea that he did not touch, and a plate of toast that grew cold on the windowsill, while Cedric reread the same paragraph of the letter for the 43rd time, as though repetition might eventually dull the edges of the words enough to make them survivable. It did not. At 10:30, Whitford appeared in the doorway. The steward had not slept either, and his normally precise appearance showed the strain, collar slightly askew, the faintest shadow of stubble along his jaw, details that on any other man would be unremarkable, but on Whitford constituted a state of emergency. "Your Grace, Garrett has sent a second dispatch." Cedric looked up. His eyes were dry and bloodshot, and they carried the unfocused quality of a man who had been staring into himself for so long that the external world had lost its resolution. "Read it." Whitford unfolded the paper. "The woman identified as the Duchess has been residing in the village of Thornhaven for approximately 11 weeks. She is renting a cottage belonging to a retired naval officer named Captain James Holt. She uses the name Mrs. Ellen Graves, The child appears healthy and is frequently seen in the company of a man identified as Dr. Samuel Wren, age 34, a physician who relocated to Thornhaven from Bristol 8 months ago. The nature of their relationship is unclear but appears domestic. Domestic. That is Garrett's word, Your Grace. I know whose word it is. Cedric stood. The movement was stiff, mechanical, the unfolding of a body that had forgotten it existed below the neck. He walked to the window and looked out at the grounds of Blackthorn Manor, the manicured lawns now soft with neglect, the hedgerows ragged, the fountain in the courtyard silent because no one had thought to maintain it since Evelyn left. She had been the one who noticed when things stopped working. She had been the one who kept the house alive. Domestic, he repeated. The word sat in his mouth like something rotten. Dr. Samuel Wren, 34 years old, a physician from Bristol. The kind of man who relocated to a fishing village because he believed in purpose over prestige, who probably made house calls in the rain and accepted payment in eggs and preserved fish, and the quiet gratitude of people who did not have titles or trust funds, or the particular kind of institutional arrogance that convinced men like Cedric that the world owed them its attention. Cedric hated him. The hatred arrived fully formed, without preamble or justification, a hot, clean flame that burned through the fog of guilt and self-recrimination and grief, and left behind something simpler, more familiar, more useful. Hatred, he understood. Hatred was structural. It gave a man a direction to face and an enemy to fight, and Cedric had spent his entire adult life converting complex emotional problems into binary conflicts because binary conflicts could be won. Prepare a legal brief, he said. Whitford did not move. Your Grace? She took my son. She took the heir to the Ravenshire title. Whatever her grievances, however justified her departure, she had no legal right to remove my child from this estate. I want a brief prepared by Harwick and Associates outlining my options for recovery of the boy. Recovery. That is the word I used. Whitford chose his next sentence with the care of a man diffusing an explosive. Your Grace, if I may, the courts will require a narrative. The circumstances of the Duchess's departure, should they become part of a public legal proceeding, would expose details that might further complicate your position in Parliament and society. You mean my affair? I mean the totality of the situation, Your Grace. Cedric turned from the window. His face had undergone a transformation during the night, a hardening of the features that went beyond exhaustion into something colder, more deliberate. The soft bewilderment of the man who had stood on a dirt lane watching his son laugh in a stranger's arms was gone. In its place was the Duke, the title, the machinery of power that had been built over generations and refined into a weapon that did not require affection or moral authority to function. Draft the brief, file it with the court, and send Garrett back to Thornhaven. I want daily reports on her movements, her contacts, her finances. I want to know every person who enters and exits that cottage. I want to know what she eats for breakfast and what time she puts the boy to sleep and whether that doctor is sleeping under the same roof as my wife. Your Grace, this course of action is not a discussion, Whitford. The steward looked at his employer for a long moment. Then he nodded once, turned, and left the nursery. Cedric stood alone in the room that should have held his son. The rocking chair sat motionless by the window. The yellow walls glowed faintly in the morning light. He picked up Evelyn's letter, folded it, and placed it inside his breast pocket. Then he straightened his coat, adjusted his cuffs, and walked downstairs to begin the systematic process of reclaiming what he had lost. Not because he loved it, but because it was his. And the distinction between those two motivations had never occurred to him as meaningful. The law firm of Harwick and Associates occupied a suite of offices on the third floor of a gray limestone building in central London, the kind of building that announced its seriousness through the deliberate absence of ornamentation. Cedric arrived on a Monday morning, unannounced, and was ushered into the senior partner's office within 4 minutes because the Ravenshire account represented enough annual revenue to justify the disruption. Albert Harwick was 62, bald, and possessed the serene, unhurried demeanor of a man who had spent 4 decades converting human suffering into billable hours. He listened to Cedric's situation with his hands folded and his expression carefully neutral, asking no questions until the Duke had finished speaking. The law is on your side, Harwick said, in principle. I am not interested in principles. I am interested in outcomes. Then allow me to be direct, Your Grace. English law grants a father unambiguous custodial rights over his legitimate children. The Duchess's removal of your son from the family home without your consent constitutes, in the strictest interpretation, a form of abduction. We can petition the courts for a recovery order. The child would be returned to your custody. Do it. However, Harwick paused. The pause was the most expensive part of his service. The Duchess will contest, and in contesting she will present the court with a narrative, the affair, the neglect, the circumstances of the birth, public sympathy, which carries no legal weight but enormous practical influence, will almost certainly favor a mother who fled an unfaithful husband to protect her newborn child. The newspapers will be merciless. Your political allies will distance themselves further, and even if the court rules in your favor, which I believe it will, on strictly legal grounds, the process of enforcement will be ugly, prolonged, and permanently damaging to whatever remains of your public standing. Cedric leaned forward. You are telling me that my wife stole my son, and the consequence of seeking justice will be my own destruction. I am telling you that the law and public opinion are different animals, Your Grace. The law is a scalpel. Public opinion is a flood. You can survive surgery. A flood takes everything. Then find a way to avoid the flood. Harwick studied him. There is another option, less dramatic but potentially more effective. A private negotiation. The Duchess has limited resources. She is living under an assumed name in a coastal village, dependent on whatever funds she managed to secure before her departure. If you approach her through intermediaries, discreetly without legal threats, you may be able to negotiate terms. Visitation rights. Perhaps eventual return. Women in her position often find that independence is more romantic in theory than in practice. You do not know my wife. I know women in desperate circumstances, Your Grace. They are more predictable than you might imagine. Cedric stood. File the petition. I want the recovery order submitted by the end of the week. Harwick inclined his head. As you wish. But I will note for the record that I advised against this approach. Note whatever you like, just get me my son. The petition was filed on a Friday. By Monday, the news had leaked. Whether through a clerk's indiscretion or a journalist's bribe, no one could determine. And by Tuesday morning, every major London newspaper carried some version of the same story. The Duke of Ravenshire, already disgraced by his affair with Lady Vivienne Hale, was now pursuing legal action to seize his infant son from the wife he had driven away through neglect and infidelity. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Parliament, which had tolerated Cedric's personal failings with the customary discretion afforded to wealthy men, could no longer maintain the pretense. Lord Asherton, the party whip, visited Blackthorn Manor personally to deliver the message. You need to withdraw the petition, Ravenshire. They were standing in the study, Asherton by the fireplace, Cedric behind his desk. The room smelled of old leather and cold ash. I will not. Then you will be asked to resign your committee positions. The party cannot be associated with a man dragging his estranged wife through the courts, while half of London calls him a tyrant. Half of London does not know the facts. Half of London does not care about facts. They care about stories. And your story right now is the worst kind. A rich man using his power to punish a woman for leaving him. It does not matter that the law supports you. It matters that the public despises you. Cedric's jaw tightened. Asherton, that woman took my heir, my son, the future of my title and my estate. Would you sit idle if your wife disappeared with your firstborn? Asherton's expression softened slightly, and in that softening, Cedric saw something worse than anger, pity. The party whip pitied him. The realization landed like a physical blow. I would not have given her a reason to leave, Asherton said quietly. Then he turned and walked out. The committee resignations followed within the week. 3 political allies publicly distanced themselves. 2 more did so privately, through carefully worded letters that expressed sympathy while establishing unambiguous separation. The Ravenshire name, which had commanded respect across 3 generations, became a cautionary tale whispered in drawing rooms and debated in editorial pages. And through it all, Cedric pressed forward. Not because he believed he would win. The growing certainty of defeat was evident in the tightening of his shoulders, the deepening lines around his mouth, the way he stopped sleeping through the night and started wandering the corridors of Blackthorn Manor at 3 in the morning like a man searching for something he could not name. He pressed forward because stopping would require admitting that his pursuit of the child was not about fatherhood. It was about control. And control was the only language Cedric had ever learned to speak. The court summons reached Thornhaven on a Wednesday. Evelyn was in the garden when the courier arrived. She was kneeling in the dirt, planting rosemary in a clay pot while the baby slept in a basket beside her, wrapped in a blanket that Mrs. Arden had sent, secretly, against the Duke's knowledge, along with a letter containing no words, only a pressed flower from the Blackthorn kitchen garden. The courier was young and uncomfortable. He handed Evelyn the sealed envelope with the apologetic expression of a man who understood that the document he carried was designed to inflict pain, and then he left quickly, as though proximity to the contents might contaminate him. Evelyn opened the envelope. She read the petition. She read it again. Then she set it down on the garden wall and returned to planting her rosemary, her hands steady, her breathing even, her face betraying nothing except a slight tightening around the eyes that Dr. Wren, arriving an hour later with fresh bread and a medical journal, noticed immediately. What happened? My husband has filed for custody of the child. Samuel Wren set down the bread. He was a tall man, lean in the way of people who forget meals when their work absorbs them, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and brown eyes that carried the particular intensity of a man who had chosen to spend his life paying attention to other people's suffering. He had come to Thornhaven to escape Bristol, where a failed engagement and a growing disillusionment with urban medicine had left him hollow and searching. He had found Evelyn 3 days after her arrival, when she appeared at his clinic door with a premature infant and a fever she had been hiding for a week. He had saved the baby's life. More accurately, he had provided the medical competence that Evelyn's fierce, instinctive mothering required to translate itself into the child's survival. He had treated the infant's respiratory weakness with steam treatments and careful monitoring. He had treated Evelyn's infection with medicine and rest. And somewhere in the quiet weeks that followed, the daily visits that became meals that became evenings spent reading by the fire while the baby slept, he had begun to feel something that he recognized as dangerous and did not attempt to stop. "What will you do?" he asked. "Fight." "With what resources?" Evelyn looked at him. Her eyes held a quality that Samuel had come to understand was the core of who she was, a resolute, unsentimental practicality that existed not despite her pain, but because of it. She was a woman who had been stripped of every comfort and discovered in the stripping that she required fewer comforts than she had been taught to believe. "I have the truth. My husband abandoned me during the most dangerous night of my life to sleep with another woman. He did not know his son had been born until 12 hours after the fact. He did not search for us out of love. He searched for us out of humiliation. The court will hear this. The court may not care. The law favors fathers, Evelyn. You know this. The law favors power, and power is not the same thing as right. In my experience, it is close enough to make the distinction academic." Evelyn stood. Dirt clung to her knees and her fingertips. She picked up the baby, who stirred and settled against her shoulder with the boneless trust of an infant who has never known a reason to be afraid. "He will not take my son. I will burn that courtroom to the ground before I let him take my son." Samuel studied her face. He had treated wounds that looked like this. Not physical wounds, but the kind that live in the architecture of a person's resolve, the structural damage that paradoxically makes the building stronger because the weak points have been identified and reinforced with something harder than the original material. "Then we need a solicitor," he said. "A good one. Someone who understands that this case is not about custody. It is about narrative." "I cannot afford a solicitor." "I can." "No." "Evelyn?" "I said no. I will not win my freedom using another man's money. That is the mechanism that trapped me in the first place. Dependence dressed as generosity. I will find another way." Samuel wanted to argue. He opened his mouth, reconsidered, and closed it. He had learned, in the weeks since this woman had walked into his clinic half dead and wholly determined, that arguing with Evelyn Ashcombe was like arguing with weather. You could object to it all you wanted. It was going to happen regardless. Then let me help in other ways. Testimony, character references, medical records proving the condition of the child when you arrived. The court should know what you were fleeing and what you built. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. The late afternoon light caught her face, and Samuel saw the woman she had been before Cedric, or rather, the woman she had always been underneath the performance of being his wife. Strong, quiet, absolutely unwilling to be owned. "Thank you," she said, and in those two words Samuel heard everything she was not yet ready to say aloud. News of the custody case spread through Thornhaven within days. It was a small village, and small villages metabolize gossip the way large cities metabolize pollution, constantly, efficiently, and with minimal concern for accuracy. But in this case, the facts were dramatic enough to require no embellishment. A duchess in hiding, a duke seeking legal vengeance, a baby caught between two worlds that could not coexist. The village responded the way small communities do when one of their own is threatened. They closed ranks. Mrs. Dawson at the general store began extending Evelyn unlimited credit. The fishermen's wives organized a rotation to help with the baby. Old Captain Holt, whose cottage Evelyn rented, announced loudly at the pub that any man who came to his property with legal papers would leave with a limp. Evelyn accepted their help with the reluctant grace of a woman learning to trust generosity after years of experiencing its transactional cousin. She wrote letters to former acquaintances in London, women she had befriended during her years as Duchess, women who had witnessed Cedric's neglect and Vivianne's presence and had said nothing because saying something would have required courage that polite society systematically discouraged. Most did not respond. 3 did. One of them was Lady Catherine Pembroke, a widow with her own legal expertise and a personal grudge against the aristocratic system that had consumed her late husband. Catherine arrived in Thornhaven on a rainy Thursday, assessed the situation with the clinical efficiency of a surgeon, and announced that she would fund Evelyn's defense. "It is not charity," Catherine said when Evelyn protested. "It is investment. If you win this case, you establish a precedent. A mother's right to protect her child from a negligent father. That precedent is worth more than whatever this costs me. And if I lose? Then at least we made him bleed in public, which, given what he did to you, is the minimum acceptable outcome." Evelyn almost smiled. It was a tight, careful expression, the smile of a woman who had forgotten the mechanics and was relearning them one muscle at a time. Cedric, meanwhile, was discovering that the machinery of legal aggression required fuel that extended beyond money. It required conviction. And conviction, he was finding, was a resource that depleted itself the more he examined his own motivations. He sat in his study late at night with Garrett's daily report spread across his desk. Detailed accounts of Evelyn's movements, her visitors, her purchases, the hours she spent walking the harbor path with the baby strapped to her chest, and the doctor walking beside her, their conversation inaudible, but their body language fluent with a comfort that made Cedric's teeth ache. He read about the village's response, the credit extended, the meals delivered, the old captain's threats. He read about people he had never met rallying around a woman he had failed to protect, providing the support structure he should have built, offering the loyalty he should have earned. And somewhere beneath the anger and the legal strategy and the obsessive surveillance, a quieter voice began asking questions he did not want to hear. "You want the boy, but do you want to be his father? Or do you want to be his owner?" He silenced the voice the way he silenced all inconvenient truths, with activity. More meetings with Harwick, more correspondence with remaining allies, more hours spent constructing the legal and social infrastructure required to force a woman who had nearly died bearing his child to return to the house where she had nearly died bearing his child. The hearing was set for June. Cedric prepared for it the way he prepared for everything, with money, with strategy, with the systematic elimination of variables. He hired additional counsel. He commissioned character witnesses. He assembled a dossier of evidence intended to portray Evelyn as an unstable woman who had endangered her child by fleeing into poverty and the company of an unknown man. But the night before he was scheduled to travel to the courthouse, something happened that no amount of preparation could have anticipated. A package arrived at Blackthorn Manor. Small, wrapped in brown paper, addressed in Evelyn's handwriting, steadier now, controlled, the handwriting of a woman who was no longer writing from a place of desperation. Cedric opened it at his desk. Inside was a single item, a photograph. Tintype, professionally made. The baby, his son, sitting upright on a blanket, 6 months old now, with fat cheeks and dark eyes and both hands reaching toward the camera as though trying to grab the lens. He was laughing. The photograph had captured the exact moment of the laugh, the mouth wide open, the eyes squeezed shut, the whole body radiating a joy so pure and uncontaminated that it looked like it belonged to a different species than the tired, suspicious, calculating creatures who populated Cedric's world. No letter accompanied it, no message, no demands or pleas or conditions, just the boy, laughing, alive, happy, in a world that did not include the Duke of Ravenshire. Cedric held the photograph for a long time. He held it until the candle on his desk burned down to a stub and the room went dark, and the only light came from the moon through the study window, cold and indifferent, illuminating the face of a child who did not know his father's name. Then he picked up his pen. He pulled a sheet of paper from the drawer, and he began to write. Not to Harwick, not to the court, not to Whitford or Garrett, or any of the soldiers in the army he had assembled to wage war on the woman who had given him a son. He wrote to Evelyn. The pen moved slowly. The words came harder than any speech he had ever delivered in Parliament, any negotiation he had ever conducted, any threat he had ever issued to a rival or a subordinate. Because these words required something that power and money and social position could not manufacture. They required honesty. And Cedric Ravenshire had spent so many years constructing an identity built on control and dominance and strategic invulnerability that honesty felt like a foreign language, one he could dimly recognize but no longer speak with any fluency. He wrote 3 pages. He crossed out most of them. He started over. He crossed out more. By dawn, a single page remained, covered in cramped, uneven script that bore no resemblance to his usual commanding hand. He did not send it. He folded it and placed it inside his breast pocket, next to Evelyn's original letter, and he sat in the dark study of Blackthorn Manor and listened to the silence of a house that had once held everything he needed and now held nothing except the evidence of his failure. The hearing was in 14 hours. Cedric stood. He straightened his coat. He looked at his reflection in the dark window and saw a man he barely recognized, thinner, older, hollowed out in places that expensive tailoring could not disguise. He had 2 choices. Walk into that courtroom with Harwick and the legal machinery and the full weight of English patriarchal law behind him, and take his son from a woman who had built a life from the wreckage he created. Or, the words sat in the silence like a live coal. He did not know what came after, that was the problem. He had never not known. He had spent his entire life as a man with a plan, a strategy, a next move calculated 12 steps ahead. And now he stood in the dark with a photograph of his laughing son in one hand and an unsent letter to his wife in the other, and no plan at all. Just the raw, terrifying, completely unfamiliar sensation of not knowing what kind of man he wanted to be when the sun came up. The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, the first gray light of dawn crept across the grounds of Blackthorn Manor. Cedric Ravenshire put on his coat. He walked to the front door. He stepped into the morning air, and he turned. Not toward London, not toward the courthouse, not toward the future he had spent months and a fortune constructing. He turned toward the road that led south, toward the coast, toward Thornhaven, toward the only door that still mattered. The blue one. The road south was 200 miles of mud and silence. Cedric drove through the night without stopping, his carriage cutting through fog so thick the lanterns threw light no further than 6 feet ahead. He had dismissed the driver at the edge of London and taken the reins himself, a decision born not from practicality, but from a desperate, inarticulate need to control something, anything, with his own hands. The horses were tired, he was tired, but exhaustion had become so familiar over the past months that it no longer registered as a condition. It was just the texture of being alive. He arrived in Thornhaven at dawn. The village looked different in the early light, smaller, quieter. The harbor sat glassy and still, fishing boats rocking in water that reflected a sky the color of old pewter. Smoke rose from a handful of chimneys. A dog barked somewhere behind a stone wall. The air tasted of salt and seaweed, and the particular kind of peace that exists only in places too small to attract ambition. Cedric left the carriage at the edge of the village and walked. His boots, expensive and impractical, slipped on the cobblestones. His coat, tailored for London drawing rooms, caught the wind and flapped against his legs. He looked absurd. He knew he looked absurd. A duke in a fishing village at 6 a.m, unshaved, red-eyed, carrying nothing but 2 letters in his breast pocket and the ruins of a plan he had abandoned somewhere around mile 140. The cottage with the blue door stood exactly as he remembered. Smoke from the chimney, laundry on the line. The herb garden, larger now, with new additions he could not identify from the road. He stopped at the gate. He had rehearsed this moment for 200 miles. He had composed speeches, discarded them, composed new ones, discarded those. He had imagined Evelyn's face, angry, cold, indifferent, afraid, and prepared responses for each version. He had strategized the way he strategized everything, converting a human encounter into a problem that could be solved through preparation and force of will. But standing at the gate, his hand on the rusted latch, all of that machinery seized and stopped. Because the door opened before he could knock, and the person standing in the doorway was not Evelyn. It was Dr. Samuel Wren. The 2 men looked at each other. The moment stretched. Cedric catalogued the details with the automatic precision of a man accustomed to assessing rivals. Tall, lean, dark hair pushed back from a face that was handsome in an uncalculated way, wearing a simple linen shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, holding a cup of tea in one hand and a medical journal in the other. He looked like he belonged here. He looked like the cottage and the garden and the salt air had been designed specifically to accommodate him. Cedric hated him with a purity that was almost refreshing. "You must be the Duke." Samuel's voice was calm. Not aggressive, not deferential, not performing any of the social calculations that Cedric was accustomed to hearing in the voices of men who stood below him in the hierarchy. Just calm. The voice of a man standing in his own doorway, secure in the legitimacy of his presence. "Where is my wife?" "She is sleeping. The baby had a difficult night." "I did not ask about the baby's night. I asked where my wife is." Samuel took a slow sip of his tea. The gesture was so unhurried, so devoid of intimidation, that it functioned as a provocation more effective than any insult. "She does not want to see you. She told me that if you came, I should tell you to leave your solicitor's address, and she would respond through counsel." "I am not here as a legal matter." "Well, everything you do is a legal matter, Your Grace. You filed a custody petition 3 weeks ago. You hired investigators to surveil her movements. You have treated this situation like a property dispute from the beginning. And now you are standing at her gate at 6 a.m. without an appointment, expecting what exactly? Gratitude?" Cedric's jaw tightened. The muscles in his neck corded. His hands, hanging at his sides, curled into fists that he did not raise but did not relax either. "You are a doctor in a fishing village. You do not get to lecture me about my marriage." "You are right, I do not. But I get to stand in this doorway and tell you that the woman inside this house nearly died because you were not where you should have been. And the child she carried out of your estate in a snowstorm, the child who could barely breathe, the child whose lungs I spent 3 weeks fighting to save, that child is healthy now. He laughs. He sleeps through the night. He reaches for his mother's face every morning with both hands. He has never had a nightmare. He has never heard a raised voice. He has never been in a room where the air felt like a negotiation." Samuel paused. His eyes held Cedric's with a steadiness that was not confrontation, but something worse: certainty. The certainty of a man who knows he is standing on the right side of a situation and does not need to prove it. "So whatever you came here to say it, but understand that you are not walking through this door without her permission, and she is sleeping." Cedric stood in the garden path with the wind pulling at his coat and the sound of gulls overhead and the faint, maddening smell of breakfast cooking inside a cottage that contained his son and his wife and a man who had become everything Cedric should have been. He did not move. He could not move. The machinery of his will, the engine that had powered him through boardrooms and ballrooms and the corridors of Parliament, had stalled on the simple, devastating fact that this man was not wrong. "I will wait," Cedric said. "You may be waiting a long time." "I have nothing but time. That is the one thing I have discovered I possess in abundance." Samuel studied him for a moment longer. Then he stepped back from the doorway, not inviting Cedric in, but not closing the door either. He set his tea on the windowsill and disappeared into the cottage. Cedric waited. He stood in the garden for 40 minutes. The sun rose higher. Villagers passed on the lane, some glancing at him with curiosity, others with open suspicion. An old man, Captain Holt, Cedric guessed, paused at the neighboring gate and stared at him with the frank, unblinking hostility of someone who has decided that social niceties are a luxury he can no longer afford. "You the Duke?" It was not a question. "I am. She does not want you here." "I am aware." "Then leave." "I cannot." Captain Holt regarded him with the expression of a man evaluating a piece of driftwood, determining whether it was worth dragging home or better left to rot. He apparently decided on the latter, because he spat into the grass, turned his back, and walked into his own house without another word. At 7:45, the blue door opened again. This time it was Evelyn. She stood in the doorway wearing a simple cotton dress, her hair pulled back in a loose knot, her feet bare on the stone threshold. She was thinner than he remembered, but not fragile. The word that came to Cedric's mind, unbidden and accurate, was tempered. She looked like metal that had been through fire and emerged harder, denser, more useful. She did not speak. Cedric realized, standing 10 feet away from the woman he had married, that he had never actually looked at her. Not really. Not with the kind of attention that registers a person as a complete, autonomous being, rather than a function within his own life. He had looked at her face 1,000 times across dinner tables and drawing rooms and the shared geography of their bedroom, and he had never once seen what Samuel Wren had apparently seen in the first week, a woman of extraordinary resilience masquerading as ordinary compliance. "I withdrew the petition," he said. Evelyn's expression did not change. "When?" "I sent word to Harwick before I left London. The custody filing will be formally withdrawn by end of business today. There will be no legal action, no further surveillance, no investigators." "Why?" The question was a single syllable, flat and unadorned, and it demanded an answer that Cedric did not have in any language he had previously spoken. "Because I looked at the photograph you sent, and I realized that the boy in that picture has never been afraid. And if I bring him back to Blackthorn Manor, the first thing he will learn is fear. And the second thing he will learn is silence. And the third thing he will learn is that the people who are supposed to love you are the ones most capable of destroying you. And those are the 3 things I learned in that house. And I will not—" His voice broke. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical crack of a man performing emotion for an audience, but with the quiet, structural failure of something that has been bearing weight beyond its capacity for too long. "I will not teach my son what my father taught me." Evelyn watched him. Her face remained still, but something shifted behind her eyes. Not forgiveness, not warmth, not the rekindling of anything that had been extinguished. Something closer to recognition, as though she were seeing, for the first time, the outlines of a damage she had always suspected but never been allowed to witness. "Come inside," she said. "The baby is awake." Cedric followed her through the blue door into the cottage. It was small, absurdly small by the standards of Blackthorn Manor, a single main room with a kitchen at one end and a sitting area at the other, furnished with mismatched chairs and a table scarred with use and shelves lined with books and dried herbs and the accumulated evidence of a life built from scratch by a woman who had decided that authenticity was worth more than comfort. The baby was on the floor, sitting on a blanket, chewing on a wooden block with the focused intensity of a person engaged in serious work. He was bigger than Cedric expected, rounder. His dark hair had thickened into curls that stood up in every direction, and his cheeks were flushed with the healthy pink that comes from sea air and adequate nutrition, and the particular kind of thriving that occurs when a child is surrounded by people who are genuinely glad he exists. Cedric knelt. The boy looked up. His eyes, dark, alert, startlingly intelligent for a child not yet 7 months old, fixed on Cedric's face with the unfiltered curiosity of someone who has not yet learned to be cautious about strangers. Cedric extended one hand. The boy grabbed his index finger and held on. The grip was astonishing. Tiny fingers wrapped around Cedric's with a strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the physical, as though the child's body understood something about connection that his developing mind could not yet articulate. Cedric felt the pressure of those small fingers and experienced a sensation he could not categorize within any framework he possessed. Not triumph, not relief, not the satisfaction of recovering stolen property or winning a contested point. Something rawer, older, more fundamental. "This is what you almost destroyed," the voice in his chest said. "This is what your indifference nearly cost you. Not a title, not an heir, not a political asset. A person. A small, complete laughing person who grabbed your finger because that is what babies do when they sense that a hand is being offered." The boy let go. He returned to his wooden block. He had already forgotten Cedric. Evelyn stood by the kitchen table with her arms crossed. Samuel was nowhere visible. He had disappeared into one of the back rooms, granting them privacy with the quiet tact of a man who understood that his presence, however welcome, would complicate a conversation that was already operating at maximum difficulty. "You can see him," Evelyn said. "But you cannot take him." "I know. And you cannot buy this. Whatever you offer, the title, the estate, the money, it is not currency here. None of it has value in this house." "I know." "Do you? Because 6 months ago you sent investigators to watch me through windows. You filed legal papers to have my son ripped from my arms. You treated me like a fugitive because I had the audacity to leave a man who could not be bothered to attend the birth of his own child." "Evelyn, I am speaking." Her voice did not rise. That was what made it devastating. She delivered each sentence at the same controlled volume, the same measured pace, the way a surgeon makes incisions, precisely, deliberately, with full awareness of the damage being inflicted and zero hesitation about its necessity. "I loved you. You should know that. Not because it matters now, but because you should understand the full scope of what you wasted. I loved you the way people love when they are young and stupid and believe that devotion can compensate for absence. I loved you through every ignored evening and every empty bed and every dinner where you looked through me like I was a window. I loved you when I found the letters. I loved you when I heard her name in your sleep. I loved you the night I gave birth alone in a room that should have had you in it. And even then, even with blood on the sheets and a baby who might not live, some part of me still wished you would walk through that door." She paused. "Not for effect, for breath. But you did not. And that wish died. And when it died, it took everything else with it. The anger, the sadness, the resentment, all of it required caring about you to survive. And I stopped caring, not out of strength or wisdom or some grand decision. I just ran out, the way a fire runs out when there is nothing left to burn." Cedric stood in the middle of the small cottage that contained the life he had forfeited, and he absorbed every word the way a man absorbs a beating, without defense, without evasion, without the consolation of believing he did not deserve it. "I am not asking you to come back," he said. "I am not asking you to forgive me. I do not know what I am asking. I came here because staying in that house one more day without saying something true to you was going to kill me in a way I cannot explain. Not physically. Something else. Something that happens to a man when he realizes he has been performing his entire life, and the performance has become the only thing left." "That sounds like your problem, Cedric, not mine." "It is. I know it is." "Then why are you here?" He looked at the baby. The boy had abandoned the wooden block and was now attempting to eat his own foot with the philosophical determination of a person exploring the limits of the possible. "Because I want him to know me. Not now, not today, but someday. I want him to know who I am, and I cannot let the only version of me that exists in this house be the one you carry. Because that version is accurate. It is completely accurate, but it is not the version I want to become." Evelyn unfolded her arms. She placed both hands flat on the table. She looked at him with an expression that contained no warmth but also no cruelty. The expression of a woman who has moved beyond both and arrived at something more useful, and more terrifying: objectivity. "Prove it," she said. "Not to me. I do not need your proof. Prove it to yourself. Go back to that empty house. Sit in that nursery. Look at what you built and what you destroyed. And then decide whether you are capable of becoming something other than what your title made you. Because the man who walked into my wedding was not a husband. He was an institution. And institutions do not get to hold babies." The cottage was quiet. The baby gurgled. Somewhere outside, a gull screamed. Cedric nodded. He did not trust himself to speak. He walked to the door, opened it, and stepped into the morning light. He was halfway down the garden path when Evelyn's voice reached him. "Cedric." He turned. She stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, the other resting against her hip. Behind her, the baby had pulled himself up against a chair leg and was standing on trembling, uncertain legs for what appeared to be the first time, his face split with a grin of astonished triumph. "His name is Thomas. I named him after the footman who rode through the storm to save his life." Cedric looked at his son standing for the first time in a house that was not his, bearing a name he had not chosen, and he felt something crack open inside his chest that was not grief and not joy, but something in between, a space where those two things could exist simultaneously without canceling each other out. "Thomas," he repeated. Then he turned and walked away. The blue door closed behind him. The garden gate swung shut. The village continued its small, unhurried mourning around him as though a man's entire identity had not just been dismantled and left in pieces on a stranger's kitchen floor. He reached his carriage. He climbed in. He sat. And then something happened that Cedric Ravenshire had not anticipated, had not prepared for, and could not have prevented with any amount of money or power or strategic foresight. A rider appeared at the end of the village road, moving fast, the horse lathered and blowing. The rider was Whitford's assistant, a young clerk named Davies who had clearly been riding through the night to reach him. Davies pulled up beside the carriage, dismounted with the clumsy urgency of a man whose body has been in a saddle too long, and thrust a sealed envelope through the window. "From Mr. Whitford, Your Grace. Urgent. He said you must read it before you return to London." Cedric broke the seal. The letter was 3 lines long. "Your Grace, Lady Vivienne Hale has filed a formal claim with the courts alleging that she is carrying your child. She is demanding public acknowledgement of paternity, a financial settlement, and the title of recognized consort. Lord Hale supports her claim and has retained counsel. The newspapers have been informed. I await your instructions." Cedric read the letter. He read it again. The words did not change. They sat on the page with the permanent, immovable weight of a detonation that has already occurred. The sound is over. The flash is gone. And all that remains is the damage spreading outward in every direction at a speed that no human reflex can outrun. He looked up. Through the carriage window, he could see the cottage with the blue door. Smoke still rose from the chimney. Laundry still hung on the line. Inside, Evelyn was holding their son. Inside, Samuel Wren was reading his medical journal. Inside, a life had been built from scratch on a foundation of honesty, and Cedric had just spent an hour standing in its doorway, saying the first true words of his life. And now Vivienne's claim would reach this village. It would reach Evelyn. It would confirm every suspicion, validate every fear, destroy every fragile molecule of possibility that had existed in the space between "I want him to know me" and "prove it." He had come to Thornhaven to begin becoming someone different. Vivienne's letter had just made certain that the old Cedric, the liar, the cheat, the man who treated women like furniture and consequences like suggestions, would follow him to the end of his life and beyond, encoded into the public record, stamped into court documents, printed in newspapers that Evelyn would read over breakfast in her small kitchen while their son ate porridge and the doctor poured tea, and the life she had built continued without him in it. Cedric folded the letter. He placed it in his breast pocket alongside Evelyn's original letter and the unsent letter he had written to her and the photograph of Thomas laughing. 3 pieces of paper. 3 versions of his destruction. He looked at the blue door one final time. Then he picked up the reins, turned the carriage north, and drove toward a London that was already preparing to devour him, carrying in his chest the knowledge that the only moment of genuine grace he had ever experienced was now separated from him by 200 miles of road and a scandal that would make reconciliation not just unlikely, not just difficult, but structurally impossible. The horses moved, the village shrank, the blue door vanished, and the Duke of Ravenshire rode toward the wreckage of his second life with the absolute crystalline understanding that the man he had been was no longer survivable, and the man he wanted to become did not yet exist. And the distance between those two versions of himself was measured not in miles or months, but in the willingness to endure a destruction so complete that nothing familiar would remain standing on the other side. The road north was very long, and Cedric Ravenshire was, for the first time in his life, completely alone on it. London smelled like smoke and judgment. Cedric reached the city limits at 4 in the morning, the horses staggering with exhaustion, foam streaking their flanks in pale ribbons that caught the lamplight. The streets were empty except for the night workers, coal men, bakers, the women who scrubbed the steps of townhouses before their owners woke to pretend that cleanliness was a natural state rather than a purchased one. None of them looked at the carriage. A duke returning to London before dawn was not unusual enough to warrant curiosity. He drove straight to Blackthorn Manor. He did not stop at the stables. He left the horses standing in the drive, their heads hanging, their breath making clouds in the cold air, and walked through the front entrance without removing his coat. The entrance hall was dark. The house was dark. Everything was dark in the particular way that large, empty buildings are dark. Not the darkness of night, but the darkness of abandonment, a density of absence that pressed against the walls like something alive. Whitford was waiting in the study. He had not slept. The evidence was in his posture, rigid, controlled, the posture of a man holding himself together through discipline because the situation had moved beyond the reach of competence. "Tell me everything," Cedric said. Whitford placed a folder on the desk. It contained 12 documents, letters from Lord Hale's solicitors, a preliminary statement from Vivienne herself, notarized and filed with the family court, a clipping from the morning edition of the Gazette, already typeset and ready for distribution, carrying a headline that Cedric read once and then turned face down on the desk because looking at it a second time would require a steadiness he did not currently possess. "Lady Vivienne claims the child was conceived in November of last year," Whitford said. "She states that the relationship was ongoing for approximately 14 months. She is requesting formal acknowledgement of paternity, a financial settlement of £40,000, and the legal designation of the child, should it survive, as a recognized member of the Ravenshire household." And Lord Hale? Lord Hale is publicly supporting his daughter's claim. He has retained the firm of Montague and Cross, which, as you know, specializes in aristocratic paternity disputes, and has a reputation for preferring publicity to discretion. Cedric sat down. The leather of the chair was cold. Everything in this house was cold. He had noticed it before in an abstract way, the way a man notices that a room needs painting. Now the cold felt personal, targeted, as though the building itself had concluded that its owner no longer deserved warmth. "Is it possible?" Whitford hesitated. It was a fraction of a second, barely perceptible, but Cedric caught it because he had spent years reading the pauses between words the way other men read financial statements. "Your Grace, is it possible that the child is mine? The timeline is consistent with the period of your relationship with Lady Vivienne. Whether the claim is true or fabricated for financial gain is a question that only Lady Vivienne can answer, and her answer, given the legal and financial incentives, may not be reliable." Cedric pressed his palms flat against the desk. The wood was smooth, polished, the surface of a desk that had supported 3 generations of Ravenshire decisions: land acquisitions, political alliances, marriage contracts, the administrative machinery of inherited power. His father had sat here, his grandfather, men who understood that the family name was not a personal possession but a public institution, and that the institution's survival required the subordination of every private impulse to the demands of legacy. And now the institution was collapsing. Not from external attack or political defeat or financial ruin, but from the accumulated weight of his own appetites, his own carelessness, his own refusal to distinguish between what he wanted and what he was entitled to. What are my options? 3. First, you acknowledge the claim, accept paternity, pay the settlement, absorb the scandal. This protects you from a prolonged legal battle, but confirms the affair in permanent legal record and gives Lady Vivienne leverage for ongoing demands. Second, you contest the claim, Deny paternity, challenge the evidence, force Vivienne to prove her case in court. This is expensive, public, and carries the risk that a court-ordered medical examination could confirm the child is yours, at which point the denial becomes perjury. Third, you negotiate privately. Offer Lady Vivienne a settlement in exchange for her withdrawal of the public claim and a signed agreement of permanent silence. This is the most common resolution in cases of this nature. It is also the most expensive. How expensive? Montague and Cross are asking $40,000. A private settlement would likely cost $60 to $80, plus ongoing payments if Lady Vivienne chooses to interpret the agreement flexibly. Cedric closed his eyes. Behind his lids, the image of Thomas standing for the first time in the cottage in Thornhaven played on a loop. Fat hands gripping the chair leg, legs trembling, face split with a grin of pure, uncomplicated achievement. The boy had stood. The boy had not needed his father to stand. The boy had not needed anything from Cedric Ravenshire except his absence. And now this. A second child. A second consequence of the same weakness that had already cost him everything worth keeping. There is a fourth option, Cedric said. Whitford waited. I go to Vivienne myself. Your Grace, that is inadvisable. Montague and Cross will use any direct contact as evidence of, I do not care what Montague and Cross will use. I do not care about the legal architecture of this situation. I care about the truth. Is this child mine, or is it a fabrication designed to extract money from a man whose vulnerabilities are now public knowledge? And the only person who can tell me the truth is Vivienne, not her father, not her solicitors, not the newspapers that will print whatever version of this story sells the most copies. Vivienne. And if she lies, Cedric opened his eyes, then I will know. Because I spent 14 months listening to her lies and believing them, and a man only makes that mistake once before he learns to recognize the sound. He stood. His body ached. His eyes burned. He had not eaten in 20 hours and had not slept in longer than that, and the sustained deprivation was creating a strange, brittle clarity in his thinking, as though exhaustion had burned away every non-essential cognitive function and left only the raw apparatus of decision. Where is she staying? The Hale townhouse on Curzon Street. Lord Hale arrived from the country estate 2 days ago with his full household. I will go now. Your Grace, it is 5 a.m. I am aware of the time. Whitford studied his employer. In 12 years of service, he had witnessed Cedric Ravenshire in every possible state, triumphant, furious, calculating, drunk, bored, politically ascendant, socially dominant. He had never seen him like this, stripped, operating without the protective layer of strategy and social performance that had always been as fundamental to the Duke's identity as his surname. Shall I accompany you? No, I will go alone. That is precisely what concerns me, Your Grace. Cedric almost smiled. It was a thin, exhausted expression that did not quite reach his eyes, but it carried something that Whitford had not seen before in the Duke's face, gratitude. Not the performative gratitude of a man acknowledging good service, but the genuine article directed at another human being for the simple act of caring whether he survived. I will be fine, Whitford. With respect, Your Grace, you have not been fine in quite some time. No, I have not, but I'm beginning to understand what fine might look like, and it does not look like hiding in this house while other people decide my future. He left before Whitford could respond. The Hale townhouse on Curzon Street was a narrow, elegant building with white columns and black ironwork, and the kind of understated grandeur that announced its owner's wealth without the vulgarity of actually mentioning money. Cedric had been here many times. He had stood in the drawing room drinking Lord Hale's brandy while Vivienne played piano, and her father pretended not to notice the way his guest's eyes followed his daughter across the room. Lord Hale had noticed. Lord Hale had always noticed. And Lord Hale had done nothing because a duke's attention, even the wrong kind, carried social currency that a baron could spend for years. Until now. Now the currency had been converted to leverage, and leverage was the only commodity that appreciated in value during a scandal. Cedric knocked on the door at 5:30. A butler answered, middle-aged, impeccable, performing the particular brand of professional outrage that domestic staff deploy when someone violates the temporal boundaries of social etiquette. The household is not receiving visitors, sir. I am not a visitor. Tell Lord Hale that the Duke of Ravenshire is here and that I will wait in the street until he receives me. I will wait until noon if necessary. I will wait until the newspapers arrive to photograph me standing on his doorstep. He may calculate whether that serves his interests." The butler disappeared. 4 minutes later, the door opened again. Lord Hale stood in the entrance hall wearing a dressing gown and an expression that combined alarm with a satisfaction he was not entirely successful at concealing. He was a small man, compact and precise, with thinning gray hair and the watchful eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime compensating for a minor title with major ambition. "Ravenshire, this is unexpected." "No, it is not." Lord Hale's mouth tightened. "Come in, then, before the neighbors see you." The drawing room was exactly as Cedric remembered. Dark wood, heavy curtains, a fireplace that had not been lit, chairs arranged in conversational clusters that facilitated the kind of intimate, low-volume discussions in which reputations were traded like livestock. "I want to see Vivienne. My daughter is resting. Your daughter filed a public claim alleging that she is carrying my child. Rest is a luxury she forfeited when she signed that document." Lord Hale poured himself a glass of water. He did not offer one to Cedric. The omission was deliberate, a small assertion of territorial control designed to remind the Duke that this was not his house and these were not his rules. "My daughter was seduced by a married man who made promises he had no intention of keeping. She is now facing the consequences of that seduction alone. The claim she has filed is not an act of aggression. It is an act of survival." "Survival. Your daughter lives in a townhouse on Curzon Street. She wears dresses that cost more than most families earn in a year. She has a father with a title, a household with a staff, and a social network that will rally to support her the moment the story breaks. Do not insult my intelligence by calling this survival." "And what would you call it?" "Extortion." The word hung in the air. Lord Hale's face did not change, but his hand, the one holding the water glass, tightened almost imperceptibly. "That is a dangerous accusation, Ravenshire." "It is a factual observation. Your daughter waited until the precise moment when my personal circumstances were most vulnerable. Estranged wife, custody scandal, public disgrace, and then filed a claim calculated to inflict maximum damage. The timing is not coincidental. The choice of Montague and Cross, a firm known for weaponizing publicity, is not coincidental. The leak to the Gazette, before I had even been formally notified, is not coincidental. This is a coordinated attack dressed up as a maternal plea, and we both know it." Lord Hale set down his glass. "You slept with my daughter for 14 months. You made her believe you would leave your wife. You promised her a future that you had neither the intention nor the integrity to deliver. And now that the consequences of your actions have arrived in a form you cannot control, you stand in my house and call my daughter an extortionist." "I never promised her anything." "You promised her everything, not in words, in actions, in the way you showed up at her door 3 nights a week, in the gifts you sent, in the letters you wrote. Letters, incidentally, that my solicitors now possess and that paint a very specific picture of a man who is not merely conducting an affair, but actively constructing an alternative life." Cedric felt something shift inside his chest. Not guilt. He had moved past guilt into a territory that guilt could not reach. Something harder. The recognition that Lord Hale was not entirely wrong. Cedric had not made explicit promises. He had done something more insidious. He had behaved as though Vivienne mattered, as though their arrangement was more than physical, as though the future contained a version of events in which she occupied a legitimate place in his life. He had done this not because he meant it, but because performing sincerity was easier than confronting the emptiness that drove him to her door in the first place. He had used her, not with malice, with something worse, with indifference disguised as affection. "I want to speak to Vivienne," he repeated. "Alone." "Absolutely not. Any conversation between you and my daughter will be conducted in the presence of counsel." "Then this conversation is over, and I will contest the claim in court, and the process of contesting it will expose your daughter to a level of public scrutiny that will destroy whatever remains of her reputation. She will be cross-examined. Her letters will be read aloud. Her romantic history will be entered into the record. And at the end of it, whether the child is mine or not, She will be known for the rest of her life as the woman who tried to leverage a scandal into a settlement. Is that what you want for your daughter, Hale? Because it is not what I want. I want the truth. And I am willing to accept the truth, whatever it is, without lawyers and without newspapers. But I need to hear it from her. Lord Hale looked at him for a long time. The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, the first sounds of London waking, cartwheels, horse hooves, the distant shout of a vendor, filtered through the curtained windows. "Wait here!" He left the room. Cedric stood alone in the drawing room and felt his heart beating with a force that seemed disproportionate to the physical demands of standing still. Each beat resonated through his rib cage and into his throat, a percussive reminder that the body does not distinguish between physical danger and existential crisis. It responds to both with the same blind, animal preparation for impact. 15 minutes later, the door opened. Vivienne walked in. She looked different. Not in the way Evelyn had looked different, tempered, strengthened, transformed by the deliberate choice to build a new life from rubble. Vivienne looked diminished. The effortless beauty that had attracted Cedric was still there, but it was overlaid with a tightness around the eyes, a pallor in the cheeks, a quality of exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness into something more corrosive. She was wearing a morning dress that fit loosely across the middle, and her hands rested on her stomach in a gesture that could have been protective or performative or both. "Cedric?" Her voice was the same. Light, breathy, calibrated to suggest vulnerability without ever actually conceding it. But underneath the familiar music, Cedric could hear something new, a tremor, faint and carefully suppressed, that told him she was afraid. "Is it mine?" Vivienne flinched, not at the question but at the delivery. Blunt, undecorated, stripped of every social convention that had previously governed their interactions. They had spent 14 months communicating through implication and suggestion and the elaborate choreography of aristocratic flirtation. And now he stood in front of her and asked the only question that mattered with the graceless directness of a man who had run out of patience for pretense. "Yes." "How do you know?" "Because there has been no one else. I know what you think of me. I know what society thinks. But there has been no one else." Cedric studied her face. He looked for the signs he had learned to recognize during their relationship. The slight leftward drift of her gaze when she adjusted the truth. The micro pause before a carefully constructed response. The way her fingers interlocked when she was performing confidence rather than feeling it. Her fingers were interlocked, but her eyes did not drift, and there was no pause. "The timing," he said. "November. The 15th, the night of the Asherton dinner. You came to me afterward. You were angry about something. A vote, I think. Something in committee. You did not want to go home." He remembered. The Asherton dinner. The committee vote on textile regulations that had gone against him. The ride to Curzon Street in the rain. The frustration burning in his chest like acid. Vivienne's door opening before he knocked, because she had been waiting, because she always waited, because waiting was the only role he had given her. "And you waited 3 months to tell me. You waited until my wife left me, until the custody scandal, until maximum damage was possible." Vivienne's chin lifted. The tremor in her voice disappeared, replaced by something colder, something that Cedric recognized because he had seen its equivalent in his own mirror 1,000 times. The survival instinct of a person who has been cornered. "I waited because I was afraid. I waited because I spent 6 weeks hoping it was not true. I waited because the man I was involved with was a married duke who had never once discussed a future with me, and I understood with perfect clarity that the moment I told him the version of me that he found attractive, the uncomplicated, undemanding, conveniently available version, would cease to exist. And I was right. Look at you. You are not here because you care about this child. You are here because this child is inconvenient. You do not know why I am here. I know exactly why you are here. You are here because your wife left you and took your heir, and you spent 3 months trying to get them back. You're here because you went to that little village and saw her building a life without you, and it broke something inside you. You are here because you were ready to start over, to become a better man, to prove to yourself and to her that you were capable of change. And then my letter arrived, and I ruined your redemption arc. The accuracy of her assessment was so complete, so surgically precise, that Cedric physically stepped back. Vivienne saw the retreat and pressed forward, her voice gaining strength with each sentence, feeding on his exposed vulnerability the way flames feed on oxygen. You used me, Cedric, not with cruelty. I almost wish it had been cruelty, because cruelty at least acknowledges the other person's existence. You used me the way you use everything, as a tool, a function, a mechanism for managing your own emotional deficiency. I was the woman who made you feel interesting. That was my entire value. And the moment I became complicated, the moment I became a person with consequences, you were done. Vivienne, I am not finished. You came here for the truth. Here it is. This child is yours. I did not plan it. I did not want it. And I certainly did not file that claim because my father told me to, or because I saw a financial opportunity. I filed it because I am 23 years old, and I'm carrying the child of a man who will never marry me, never acknowledge me, never give me or this baby anything resembling a real place in his world. And the only leverage I have, the only power available to a woman in my position, is the one thing your entire class is terrified of: the truth, spoken publicly, in a venue where it cannot be suppressed. The room was very quiet. Lord Hale had not returned. Whether he was listening from another room or had genuinely given them privacy was impossible to determine and ultimately irrelevant. The conversation had moved beyond the reach of third-party management. Cedric looked at the woman he had spent 14 months visiting in the dark, the woman whose laughter he had preferred to his wife's silence, whose uncomplicated admiration had been the narcotic he administered to himself 3 nights a week to avoid confronting the void that lived at the center of his existence. He had never seen her before. Not really. He had seen a reflection, the version of himself that her attention created, the clever, magnetic, powerful man that existed only in her eyes. He had used her gaze as a mirror and called it intimacy. "What do you want?" he said. "Not what your father wants. Not what your solicitors want. What do you want?" Vivienne's hands tightened on her stomach. The gesture was small, instinctive, the unconscious motion of a body protecting something it has not yet decided to claim. "I want my child to have a name, not your name. I do not want your name. I want a name that is not preceded by the word illegitimate in every conversation for the rest of their life. I want enough money to raise this child without depending on a father who views my existence as a political liability, and I want you to never come to this house again. And the public claim? Withdraw it? After what you did to me? After 14 months of being your secret, your escape valve, your antidote to your own mediocrity? No. The claim stays. Not because I want your money, because I want the record to show that I existed, that this child existed, that the mighty Duke of Ravenshire did not simply walk away from every woman he damaged and continue living as though the damage was a weather event that happened to him rather than something he created. Cedric breathed. The air in the drawing room tasted stale, recycled, the air of a room where too many difficult truths had been spoken in too short a time. His pulse hammered in his temples. His hands were trembling, not with anger, not with fear, but with the particular vibration of a body that has been pushed to the absolute edge of its capacity for revelation and is now operating on the thin, volatile fuel of pure adrenaline. He thought about Evelyn. He thought about Thomas standing for the first time, gripping the chair leg, grinning. He thought about the blue door and the herb garden and the smell of bread and the sound of his son's laughter carried on salt wind. He thought about the man he had told Evelyn he wanted to become, a man who did not own but cared, who did not control but showed up, who did not treat people as functions within his own narrative but recognized them as narratives of their own. And he looked at Vivienne, afraid, furious, pregnant, cornered, wielding the only weapon available to a woman in a world designed to keep women weaponless. And he understood that becoming the man he wanted to become did not start with Evelyn. It started here, in this room, with this woman, with the consequence he had created and the damage he had caused and the truth he could no longer afford to avoid. "Keep the claim public," he said. Vivienne blinked. "I will not contest it. I will not deny paternity. I will not send solicitors or investigators or anyone else to intimidate you into silence. If the child is mine, I will acknowledge it publicly. I will provide financial support. Not 40,000. We will negotiate a reasonable figure without your father's firm involved. And I will ensure that the child carries whatever name you choose without the word illegitimate attached to it. I cannot change the law on that front, but I can make it publicly and permanently clear that I take responsibility for my actions. You are serious. I have never been less certain of anything in my life. But certainty is what got me here. Certainty that I was entitled to do whatever I wanted without consequence. Certainty that women existed to serve functions in my life rather than to live their own. Certainty that power meant never having to admit I was wrong. I am done with certainty, Viviane. I am interested in something more terrifying. I am interested in the truth. Viviane stared at him. Her eyes were wet. She did not blink. She did not wipe her face. She stood in the drawing room of her father's townhouse and allowed herself to be seen crying by the man who had reduced her to a secret. And the act of allowing that visibility was itself a form of defiance that Cedric recognized because he had just witnessed its equivalent in a cottage with a blue door 200 miles south. "Get out of my house," she whispered. He left. The street outside was bright with early morning sun. London was waking. Carriages moved along Curzon Street carrying men to their offices, their clubs, their meetings, their tidy compartmentalized lives where consequences stayed in their designated boxes and never bled through into the daylight. Cedric walked. He did not take the carriage. He walked through Mayfair and into the park and along paths he had walked 100 times before without ever noticing the trees, the birds, the children being pushed in prams by nursemaids, the ordinary, relentless business of living that continued regardless of what happened inside drawing rooms and courthouses and empty nurseries. He walked until his legs ached and his feet burned inside his expensive, impractical boots, and then he sat down on a bench and pulled out the 3 pieces of paper he had been carrying against his chest for days. Evelyn's letter. The one she wrote in blood and exhaustion, the one that ended with the sentence that had cracked him open, the photograph of Thomas, laughing, reaching, and the letter he had written to Evelyn that he had never sent. He unfolded the unsent letter. He read it. The words were clumsy, inadequate, the flailing attempts of a man trying to speak a language he had never been taught. But they were true. Every graceless, stumbling sentence was true. He folded it again. He placed all 3 documents back in his pocket. Then he looked up. Across the park, walking toward him on the gravel path with the deliberate pace of a man who has been searching for someone and has finally found him, was Whitford. The steward's face was gray. "Your Grace, there is a development." Another one. Garrett's final report arrived an hour ago from Thornhaven. Cedric's stomach dropped. The sensation was physical, immediate, a gravitational shift in his internal organs that his body registered as danger before his mind could process the information. What happened? Whitford handed him a single sheet of paper. Cedric read it standing in the middle of a London park, surrounded by the sounds of birds and children and the mechanical indifference of a world that had no interest in the destruction of one man's carefully maintained fictions. The report was 4 sentences long. The Duchess has been informed of Lady Viviane Hale's public claim by a Gazette correspondent who arrived in Thornhaven this morning seeking comment. Dr. Wren attempted to prevent the interaction but was unsuccessful. The Duchess read the article in its entirety. She has instructed Captain Holt to deny entry to all visitors, including representatives of the Duke, effective immediately. Cedric lowered the paper. The park continued around him. Sunlight moved across the grass. A child laughed somewhere nearby, a sound so similar to Thomas's laugh in the photograph that it felt like a physical assault. He had gone to Thornhaven to begin becoming someone different. He had withdrawn the custody petition. He had stood in that cottage and said the first honest words of his life. He had looked at his son and felt something that was not ownership but love, actual love, the kind that does not negotiate or calculate or require reciprocity. And then Viviane's claim had detonated across the public record, and the blast wave had traveled 200 miles south and blown through the blue door and destroyed whatever fragile, tentative, barely possible thing had existed in the space between Prove It and his son's name. Evelyn knew. She knew about Viviane. She knew about the second child. She knew that the man who had stood in her kitchen and said, "I will not teach my son what my father taught me," had been producing additional children with the mistress he was supposed to have abandoned. The timing would look deliberate. The visit to Thornhaven, the emotional confession, the withdrawal of the custody petition, all of it would now read as strategy, as manipulation, as the calculated performance of a man who knew the scandal was coming and rushed to secure his position with his wife before the explosion reached her. It was not true, but it did not matter whether it was true. What mattered was what it looked like, and it looked like exactly the kind of thing the old Cedric would have done. Because the old Cedric would have done it. That was the unbearable part. The man Cedric was trying to stop being was exactly the kind of man who would have used a visit to his estranged wife as a preemptive strike against an incoming scandal. And Evelyn knew that man. She had been married to that man. She had given birth alone while that man drank wine in another woman's bedroom. She had no reason, none, zero, absolutely no foundation of evidence or experience to believe that the man who stood in her cottage yesterday was any different from the man who had destroyed her. Cedric held the report in both hands. The paper shook. His hands shook. The bench beneath him felt insubstantial, as though the physical world had thinned to accommodate the weight of what was happening inside his chest. Whitford stood nearby, silent, waiting. "Send word to Harwick," Cedric said. His voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. "Tell him I will not contest Vivienne's claim. Tell him to begin drafting an acknowledgement of paternity and a financial settlement to be negotiated directly without publicity. Tell him I want it done quietly, quickly, and without a single additional word appearing in any newspaper." And Thornhaven? Cedric looked across the park. A woman was walking with a child on the far side of the pond. The child's hand wrapped around her finger, their pace slow, synchronized, the unconscious choreography of a bond so fundamental that it required no thought and no negotiation. Do nothing. Send no one. Write no letters. "Your Grace, she asked me to prove it. She said, go back to that empty house and decide whether I am capable of becoming something other than what my title made me. That is what I am going to do." "And your son?" Cedric stood. His legs were unsteady. His vision blurred for a moment and then cleared, the way vision clears after a blow to the head, the world snapping back into focus with a sharpness that is almost painful. "My son is with his mother. His mother is the strongest person I have ever known. He is safe. He is loved. He is standing on his own legs in a house where no one has ever raised a voice." He paused. His throat worked. "That is more than I ever gave him, and right now it is more than I deserve to take away." Cedric walked back to Blackthorn Manor alone. He entered through the front door. He climbed the stairs. He opened the nursery. Yellow walls, white furniture, the rocking chair by the window. He sat down in the chair. He placed the photograph of Thomas on the windowsill, propped against the glass so the morning light fell across his son's laughing face. And then the Duke of Ravenshire, the man who had controlled empires and destroyed rivals and bent the machinery of English society to his will for the better part of a decade, put his head in his hands in an empty nursery and began the only work that had ever truly mattered. He began to wait. Not for Evelyn to forgive him, not for the scandal to pass, not for the courts or the newspapers or society to render their verdict. He waited for the man he had promised to become to arrive, because that man did not exist yet. He was somewhere in the distance, on the other side of a transformation that could not be purchased or inherited or performed into existence. He could only be built, slowly, painfully, from the raw material of a life that had been stripped of every comfortable lie and left standing in the wreckage with nothing to offer except the willingness to begin again. The rocking chair moved. The photograph caught the light. And somewhere on the southern coast, behind a blue door that was now locked against everything that bore the Ravenshire name, a boy named Thomas pulled himself up on unsteady legs and took his first real step across a kitchen floor, reaching for his mother, who caught him, who would always catch him, who had walked out of a burning house with him in her arms and built a world where falling was not a failure, but a beginning. The boy did not know about dukes or scandals or letters written in blood. He did not know that his father sat 200 miles north in an empty room, fighting to become worthy of a name he had not been consulted on. He knew only this, that his legs worked, that the floor was solid, that his mother's hands were waiting, and that was enough. For now, that was enough. A year is not a long time in the life of a house. Paint does not peel in a year. Stone does not crack. Foundations do not shift. But a year is long enough for the quality of silence inside a house to change, to evolve from the silence of absence into something denser, more permanent, the silence of a structure that has accepted its emptiness as a permanent condition rather than a temporary state. Blackthorn Manor had accepted it. Cedric noticed the change the way a man notices his own aging, not in a single revelatory moment, but in the accumulation of small daily evidence. The hallway that had once echoed with staff moving between rooms now absorbed his footsteps without returning them. The dining room table, set for one by a kitchen staff that had dwindled from 12 to 4, gleamed with a polish that existed solely for itself, since no guests had been entertained in 9 months. The gardens continued their seasonal rhythms through the efforts of a single remaining groundskeeper, but the flower beds that Evelyn had designed, the ones she had sketched on graph paper during their second year of marriage while Cedric ignored her from behind a newspaper, had been replaced by functional hedgerows because no one else understood the planting scheme. He had not left the estate in 11 months. Not for Parliament, not for society, not for any of the obligations that had once filled his calendar with the manufactured urgency of a life designed to avoid stillness. He had resigned his remaining committee positions by letter. He had closed the London townhouse. He had instructed Whitford to manage the estate's financial affairs without consultation, a delegation of power so complete that it constituted, in practical terms, an abdication. The scandal had run its course with the predictable trajectory of all scandals: ignition, conflagration, sustained burn, slow fade, residual smoke. Lady Vivian's paternity claim had been settled privately, as Cedric instructed, with a financial arrangement that was generous enough to eliminate any incentive for further publicity. Vivian had given birth to a daughter in September, a girl named Charlotte, according to Whitford, who received updates through legal channels that Cedric had authorized but could not bring himself to read. A daughter. He had a daughter he had never seen, born to a woman he had used as an anesthetic, growing up in a household that would forever define itself in relation to his failure. Another child whose first understanding of the word father would be shaped by his absence. The knowledge sat inside Cedric like a stone in his stomach, heavy and permanent, and he carried it through his days the way people carry chronic pain, not by overcoming it, but by reorganizing his life around its unrelenting presence. He woke at 5 every morning. He walked the grounds for 2 hours regardless of weather, following paths that Evelyn had once walked with a specific purpose he had never bothered to ask about. He ate breakfast alone. He read, not newspapers, not parliamentary reports, not the political correspondence that had once constituted his entire intellectual life, but books, novels mostly, pulled from the library shelves that Evelyn had organized and he had never touched. He read stories about people whose interior lives were rendered with a precision and empathy that made him realize, with a shame so deep it was almost physical, how little he had ever understood about the internal experiences of the people closest to him. He read about women, specifically, deliberately, exclusively for the first 3 months. Women written by women. Women whose inner worlds were complex and contradictory and stubbornly resistant to the kind of simplification that men like Cedric had always applied to them. He read about wives who endured and wives who left, and wives who burned their houses down and rebuilt them from the ash. He read about mothers whose love was ferocious and imperfect, and occasionally destructive. He read about mistresses who were not villains and duchesses who were not saints and daughters who grew up in the shadows of powerful men and spent their entire lives trying to step into their own light. He did not read these books because he enjoyed them. Most of them made him feel sick. He read them because they constituted the education he had never received, the education in human recognition that his title, his wealth, his gender, and his social position had allowed him to avoid for 30 years. Whitford observed this transformation with the cautious, slightly bewildered attention of a man watching a building being renovated from the inside. The external structure remained the same. The Duke still dressed properly, still maintained the baseline protocols of personal presentation, still issued instructions with the clipped precision of a man accustomed to authority. But something behind his eyes had shifted. The old Cedric had looked at the world with the evaluative gaze of a man calculating what each person and situation could offer him. The new Cedric looked at things the way a man looks at a landscape after a disaster. Carefully, humbly, aware that the ground beneath his feet was no longer guaranteed. "Your Grace," Whitford said one morning in February, standing in the study doorway with the careful posture of a man about to deliver information he was not certain would be welcome. "A letter has arrived from Thornhaven." Cedric's hands, wrapped around a cup of tea, tightened imperceptibly. He did not look up. "From whom?" "Dr. Wren." Cedric set down the tea. The cup made a small, precise sound against the saucer. He extended his hand. Whitford placed the letter in it, nodded, and left the room. The envelope was plain. The handwriting was neat, angular, the handwriting of a man who wrote medical notes and prescriptions, and was accustomed to prioritizing legibility over aesthetics. Cedric held it for a full minute before opening it, because the act of opening it would convert uncertainty into fact, and uncertainty, for all its discomfort, at least preserve the possibility that the contents might not be devastating. He opened it. The letter was short. Samuel Wren wrote the way he spoke, directly, without ornamentation, without the social padding that most people use to soften the impact of difficult information. "Your Grace, I write not as Evelyn's advocate, but as her physician. Thomas has been ill. A respiratory infection that developed 3 weeks ago has progressed despite treatment. His lungs, compromised since birth, have not responded to conventional medicine. I have consulted colleagues in London by correspondence, and their consensus is that the boy requires specialized care that is not available in Thornhaven. Evelyn is aware of this. She has not slept in 6 days. She has not asked me to write this letter. She would be furious if she knew I had written it. I am writing it anyway because the child's welfare supersedes her pride and, frankly, supersedes yours. If you have access to physicians or medical facilities in London that could provide advanced respiratory treatment for an infant, the time to act is now. Not next week. Not after deliberation. Now. Respectfully, Samuel Wren." Cedric read the letter 3 times. Then he stood up. The speed of his movement knocked the teacup off the desk. It shattered on the floor. He did not notice. "Whitford." The steward appeared in under 30 seconds, the urgency in Cedric's voice having penetrated 3 walls and a hallway. "Contact Dr. James Hargrove immediately. Tell him I need the name of the best respiratory physician in London for an infant with compromised lungs. I need the name within the hour. Then prepare the carriage. Fresh horses. I am going to Thornhaven." Whitford did not ask questions. He did not raise logistical objections or suggest alternatives, or perform any of the managerial caution that he would normally apply to an abrupt, emotionally driven decision. He simply said yes and disappeared. Cedric stood in the study among the broken pieces of the teacup and felt his heart hammering with a violence that made his vision pulse. Thomas was sick. Thomas was sick, and the lungs that had nearly killed him at birth were failing again, and Evelyn had not slept in 6 days, and the doctor who had saved the boy's life once was now writing letters to the man who had nearly destroyed it, because medicine had limits and desperation did not observe jurisdictional boundaries. He picked up Samuel's letter. He folded it and placed it in his breast pocket, next to the other letters, next to the photograph, next to the accumulated paper evidence of every failure and every fragile hope that he had carried against his chest for a year, like a penitent carrying stones. Then he walked out of the study, past the shattered teacup, past the dark hallways and the empty rooms and the fading portraits of Ravenshire ancestors who stared down at him with the frozen, disapproving faces of men who had never been required to earn anything they possessed. The ride to Thornhaven took 31 hours. Cedric changed horses 3 times. He did not sleep. He did not eat. The carriage rocked through darkness and rain and the gray, featureless English countryside that separated his world from the one Evelyn had built, and Cedric sat in the leather seat and stared at his hands and thought about lungs. Specifically, he thought about the lungs of a boy who had been born too early in a cold room because his father was 23 miles away, performing his own irrelevance. He thought about Margaret clearing the infant's airway with her finger. He thought about the 8 seconds of silence before the first thin cry. He thought about the bluish tint of the baby's skin and the weak, jerky movements, and Mrs. Arden taking over with the fierce competence of a woman who understood that some emergencies do not wait for qualified personnel. Those lungs, damaged from the start, compromised by the circumstances of a birth that should have taken place in a warm, well-staffed, medically prepared environment with a physician present and a husband holding his wife's hand. Instead, the boy had arrived in blood and panic and the amateur heroism of household servants, and his lungs had carried the scar of that arrival ever since, a physical record of his father's absence inscribed into the tissue of his breathing. Cedric arrived in Thornhaven at dusk. The village was quieter than he remembered. The harbor was empty. The fishing boats were still out, their absence creating a hollowness in the landscape that matched the hollowness in his chest. He went directly to the cottage. The blue door was closed. No smoke from the chimney. The laundry line was empty. The herb garden, which had been thriving when he last saw it, showed signs of neglect. Wilted rosemary, untended soil, the evidence of a household whose attention had been redirected entirely toward a single consuming crisis. He knocked. Samuel Wren opened the door. The doctor looked like a man who had been operating beyond his capacity for weeks. His eyes were sunken, ringed with dark circles so pronounced they looked like bruises. His shirt was wrinkled. His hands, hanging at his sides, had the slight tremor of chronic fatigue. "You came." "You told me to come now. I am here now." Samuel stepped aside. Cedric entered the cottage for the second time. The main room had been transformed into a makeshift medical station. The table was covered with bottles, cloths, a basin of water that smelled of eucalyptus. A small cot had been set up near the fireplace, surrounded by blankets and cushions and a copper kettle that was producing steam in a slow, steady stream designed to keep the air moist. Thomas was in the cot. He was smaller than Cedric expected. Not the fat, laughing, foot-grabbing infant of the photograph, but a diminished version, pale and still, his breathing audible from across the room. Each breath was a small battle, a labored drawing in followed by a rattling exhalation that sounded like paper being crumpled inside his chest. Evelyn sat beside the cot on a wooden chair. She did not look up when Cedric entered. She did not look up because she had not taken her eyes off her son in hours, possibly days, and the act of redirecting her attention would require expenditure of energy that she could not afford. She looked destroyed. Not the controlled, purposeful destruction of the woman who had left Blackthorn Manor in a snowstorm with a newborn. This was the destruction of a mother watching her child struggle to breathe, the kind of destruction that operates below the level of will and cannot be managed or strategized or survived through determination alone. Her hair was unwashed, her face was gray. Her hands, resting on her knees, were absolutely still in the way that hands are still when the body has moved past trembling into a kind of frozen, concentrated endurance. "I brought a physician's name," Cedric said. His voice was low, careful, pitched to avoid disturbing the fragile equilibrium of the room. "Dr. Elias Hartley. He is the leading respiratory specialist at St. Thomas's Hospital in London. I have arranged for him to travel to Thornhaven. He can be here in 2 days. Evelyn did not respond. Samuel, standing behind Cedric, spoke. "Evelyn, he can help." 2 days. Her voice was hoarse, scraped thin by sleeplessness and the sustained effort of keeping herself functional. 2 days is a long time when your child is not breathing properly. "He is breathing," Samuel said gently. "His oxygen is adequate. His fever has stabilized. 2 days is manageable." "You said that a week ago. You said the fever would break in 48 hours. It did not break. You said the infection would respond to treatment. It has not responded. Every timeline you have given me has been a lie designed to keep me from losing my mind. And I appreciate the intention, Samuel, but I cannot absorb one more optimistic prediction that does not materialize." "This is not my prediction," Samuel said. "This is a London specialist with 20 years of experience in pediatric respiratory disease. His success rate is documented. This is not optimism. This is the best available option." Evelyn finally looked up. Her eyes moved past Samuel and found Cedric. She stared at him with an expression that contained so many contradictory emotions: fury, exhaustion, a desperate, unwilling hope, the residual bitterness of a betrayal she had not finished processing, that the net effect was a kind of terrible blankness, the face of a woman who has run out of capacity for feeling and is operating on the mechanical reserves of maternal instinct. "Why are you here?" "Because my son is sick." "He has been your son for 18 months. You have been here twice." "I know." "You know. That is your answer. You know." I do not have a better answer. I have a doctor who can help Thomas. I have the resources to bring him here within 2 days. I have spent the last year sitting in an empty house trying to become someone who deserves to stand in this room, and I do not know whether I have succeeded. And right now it does not matter whether I have succeeded, because the only thing that matters is that boy's breathing and the fact that you have not slept in 6 days and you are going to collapse if someone does not help you. The room was quiet except for Thomas's labored breaths. Evelyn looked at Cedric for a long time. He stood still under her gaze. He did not defend himself. He did not negotiate. He did not perform contrition or humility or any of the emotional displays that the old Cedric would have deployed as tools to achieve a desired outcome. He simply stood and allowed her to see him, unshaved, rumpled, running on adrenaline and terror, a man who had driven through the night because a doctor he had never met told him his son needed help. "Fine," Evelyn said. "Bring your doctor, help Thomas, and then leave." "Evelyn?" "I said bring your doctor. I did not say we are having a conversation." Cedric nodded. He turned to Samuel. "I need to send a message to London confirming Dr. Hartley's travel. The post office is on the main street. It opens at 7. I will wait." He sat down on the floor. Not in a chair. There was only one, and Evelyn was in it. He sat on the stone floor of the cottage with his back against the wall and his legs stretched out and his eyes fixed on the cot where his son lay breathing his small, difficult breaths. Evelyn did not object to his presence. She did not acknowledge it either. She returned her attention to Thomas, adjusting the blanket around his shoulders with the infinite, microscopic care of a woman who has reduced her entire existence to the maintenance of a single life. Samuel brought tea. He placed a cup in Cedric's hand and another on the windowsill near Evelyn, and then sat down at the table and opened a medical journal and pretended to read while actually monitoring the baby's breathing from across the room with the trained, automatic attention of a man who had been doing it for weeks. The three of them sat in the cottage through the night. Nobody spoke. Thomas breathed. The steam kettle hissed. Outside, the tide changed and the harbor water shifted and the village settled into the deep, restorative quiet of a place that had no interest in the dramas of dukes and duchesses and custody disputes and paternity scandals. At 4 a.m, Evelyn's head dropped. Her chin touched her chest, her eyes closed. The exhaustion that she had been fighting for 6 days finally breached her defenses, and she slipped into sleep the way a drowning person slips beneath the surface, not by choice, but by the body's ultimate refusal to cooperate with the mind's demands. Cedric moved. He crossed the room quietly, pulled a blanket from the shelf, and draped it over her shoulders. Then he sat down on the floor beside the cot and took over the vigil. Thomas's face, in the dim firelight, was heartbreakingly beautiful. Not in the way that healthy children are beautiful, robust and bright and bursting with energy. Beautiful in the way that fragile things are beautiful, the way a candle flame is beautiful, the way anything that could be extinguished at any moment is beautiful precisely because of its precariousness. Cedric watched his son breathe. He counted the breaths. He listened to the rattle and the wheeze and the tiny, fierce effort that each inhalation required, and he understood, sitting on that cold stone floor in a cottage that smelled of eucalyptus and desperation, that this was the first time in his life he had ever genuinely attended to another person's existence. Not managed, not controlled, not strategized around. Attended to, sat with, been present for. The distinction was so fundamental and so obvious that its late arrival constituted the most damning indictment of his character he had ever received. He had been a man who moved through the world like weather, powerful, impersonal, affecting everything he touched without ever being affected in return. He had married a woman and produced a child and maintained a mistress, and produced another child and occupied positions of political influence and social authority, and throughout all of it, throughout every human interaction he had conducted over 3 decades of privileged existence, he had never once simply sat still and paid attention to the person in front of him. Thomas coughed, a small, wet sound that made Cedric's stomach clench. He reached into the cot and placed his hand on the boy's chest, gently, barely touching, just enough to feel the rise and fall, the labored mechanics of breathing, the heartbeat beneath his palm, rapid, light, the heartbeat of a creature fighting to stay alive with every tool its small body possessed. "I am here," Cedric whispered. The words meant nothing to a sleeping infant. They meant everything to the man who spoke them. Dr. Elias Hartley arrived 37 hours later. He was a short, compact man in his 50s with wire-rimmed spectacles and the brisk, unsentimental manner of a physician who had spent decades working in conditions that did not reward sentiment. He examined Thomas with thorough, efficient hands, while Evelyn stood rigid beside the cot, and Cedric stood in the corner, and Samuel hovered with the anxious deference of a colleague watching a superior operate in his field. "The lungs are compromised," Hartley said when the examination was complete. "Scarring from the premature birth, exacerbated by the current infection. The infection itself is treatable. I will prescribe a regimen that should resolve it within 10 days. But the underlying damage to the lungs is permanent. He will always be vulnerable. Winters will be difficult. He will need careful monitoring throughout childhood." "Will he survive?" Evelyn's voice was stripped to its essential components. No fear, no hope, no social performance. Just the question. "He will survive this infection. With proper care, proper environment, and access to medical support, he can live a normal life. The lungs will strengthen as he grows. But he cannot stay here." "What do you mean?" "This cottage, the damp, the salt air. Coastal living is therapeutic for many respiratory conditions, but for lungs with this specific type of scarring, the combination of maritime moisture and cold winter winds creates a persistent irritant. He needs dry air. Inland. A well-heated residence with consistent temperature control." The silence that followed Hartley's words was the loudest silence Cedric had ever experienced. It filled the cottage the way water fills a sinking vessel, rising, unstoppable, occupying every available space. Evelyn understood. Cedric could see it in the set of her jaw, the slight widening of her eyes, the way her hands found each other and locked together in front of her body. She understood that the life she had built, the cottage, the garden, the village, the harbor, the community that had wrapped itself around her and Thomas like a shield, was medically incompatible with her son's survival. And she understood where the dry air was, where the well-heated residence with consistent temperature control existed, where the money for ongoing medical care and specialized physicians and everything else that Thomas would need lived. Blackthorn Manor. "No," Evelyn said. "Evelyn," Samuel's voice, carefully neutral. "Listen to what he is saying. I heard what he said. The answer is no. I will find another place. Inland, dry, warm. There are other houses in England." "Houses you can afford?" Cedric spoke for the first time since Hartley's arrival. His voice was quiet, measured, carrying none of the authority or entitlement that had once characterized every word he spoke. "Houses with medical staff and heating systems and access to physicians who can monitor his condition year-round?" Evelyn turned on him. The fury that she had been suppressing for a year erupted with a force that made even Hartley step back. Do not use my son's illness to maneuver me back into your house. Do not stand there with your expensive doctor and your practical concerns and your suddenly reasonable voice and pretend that this is not exactly what you wanted from the beginning. A reason to bring us back. A justification that makes you look like a savior instead of the man who caused this in the first place. "I caused this?" "You were not there. You were not there when he was born. If you had been there, he would have been born in a hospital with proper equipment and a physician present. His lungs would not be scarred. He would not be sick. He would be a normal, healthy child. And I would not be standing in this cottage having this conversation with a man who treated me like wallpaper for 4 years and then spent a year sitting in an empty nursery pretending that regret constitutes change." The words landed like blows. Each one found its target. Each one drew blood. Cedric absorbed them the way he had learned to absorb Evelyn's truth, without defense, without deflection, without the narcissistic reflex of converting her pain into his own narrative of suffering. "You are right," he said. "I know I am right. You are right about all of it. I was not there. The damage to his lungs is a consequence of the conditions of his birth, and those conditions existed because I was not where I should have been. I am the reason he is sick, not the infection, not the salt air, me. my absence, my choices. Everything that has happened to this boy can be traced back to a man who did not show up. He paused. His throat was tight, his eyes burned. And I am asking you to let me show up now. Not as your husband, not as the master of Blackthorn Manor, not as the Duke of Ravenshire, as his father. A father who arrived late and has no right to be here and is asking for the chance to do one useful thing with a life that has so far been spectacularly useless. Evelyn stared at him. The fury was still there, still burning, but something else had moved beneath it. The same recognition he had seen in her face a year ago, in this same cottage, when he had said, "I will not teach my son what my father taught me." She saw something in him that she did not want to see, because seeing it would require her to revise a judgment she had already rendered, and revising judgments requires energy she did not have and trust she could not afford. "I am not coming back to you," she said. "I am not asking you to come back to me. I am not living in that house. The house has a separate wing, the east wing. It has its own entrance, its own kitchen, its own living quarters. You would not have to see me. You would not have to speak to me. Thomas would have access to dry air, heated rooms, and medical care. And you would have... what? What would I have?" Cedric looked at her. He looked at her the way he should have looked at her 10 years ago, 6 years ago, the night she was giving birth, every morning across the breakfast table, with the full, undivided, unreserved attention of a man who understands that the person in front of him is not a feature of his world, but a world unto herself. You would have the freedom to leave whenever you want. The East Wing is not a cage. It is an offer. If Thomas improves in the coastal air somewhere else, you go. If you find an inland house that meets his needs without my involvement, you go. If you wake up one morning and decide that my presence, even separated by 200 feet of hallway, is more than you can stand, you go. The door is never locked. The door is never even closed. It is just open. Permanently. Samuel Wren, standing by the window, said nothing. He did not need to speak. His silence was its own communication, the silence of a man who understood that this decision was not his to make, but whose opinion, if asked, would be that the child's health trumped the mother's justified resentment. Evelyn looked at Thomas. The boy was sleeping, his breathing still labored, his small body fighting the infection with the same relentless, instinctive determination that his mother fought everything, not with strategy or resources, but with the pure biological refusal to stop. "The East Wing," she said. "The East Wing. Separate entrance, separate entrance. And Samuel comes with us." Cedric blinked. He looked at Samuel. Samuel looked at Evelyn. Something passed between them, a current of understanding so intimate and so specific that Cedric felt it the way a man standing outside a window feels the warmth from inside. Not for him, not excluding him, just existing in a space he had not earned the right to enter. "If Dr. Wren is willing," Cedric said. Samuel turned from the window. He looked at Cedric with the same calm, unhurried gaze he had directed at him from this doorway a year ago. Not hostile, not deferential, not performing any social calculation. Just looking, seeing. "I am willing," Samuel said. "For the boy." "For the boy," Cedric agreed. They moved to Blackthorn Manor 3 weeks later, after Thomas's infection had been treated and his strength had returned enough to survive the journey. The East Wing was prepared exactly as Cedric had described. Separate entrance, separate kitchen, separate quarters, a self-contained household within the larger estate that allowed Evelyn to live under the same roof as the man she had married, without ever being required to inhabit the same life. Cedric saw Thomas once a day. Evelyn established the schedule, 30 minutes in the afternoon, in the East Wing sitting room, supervised. She sat in the corner with a book she did not read, while Cedric sat on the floor with his son, and learned through trial and error the elementary mechanics of fatherhood. Thomas was walking now, unsteady, determined, prone to falling, and getting up and falling again with the cheerful persistence of someone who has not yet learned that falling is supposed to be discouraging. He brought Cedric objects, blocks, spoons, a tattered cloth rabbit that he carried everywhere, and waited with expectant eyes for reactions that Cedric did not always know how to provide. He learned, slowly, clumsily, with the same graceless effort that characterized everything he had done since the night he sat in the nursery and decided to begin. Months passed. Thomas's lungs strengthened in the dry, heated air of Blackthorn Manor. Dr. Hartley visited quarterly. Samuel Wren monitored the boy daily. Evelyn maintained her boundaries with a precision that never wavered. 30 minutes, supervised, no exceptions. Until one afternoon in October when Thomas took a block from his collection, walked across the sitting room on his sturdy, confident legs, and placed it in Cedric's hand. Then he walked back to his mother, took another block, and placed it in her hand. Then he returned to the middle of the room and sat down and looked at both of them with the uncomplicated expectation of a child who does not understand why the two people he loves most refuse to play together. Evelyn looked at the block in her hand. Cedric looked at the block in his. Thomas waited. Evelyn stood up from her chair. She crossed the room. She sat down on the floor beside her son, 3 feet from Cedric, and placed her block on the carpet next to his. "He wants us to build something," she said. "Yes, I am not forgiving you. I know. I may never forgive you. I know that too. But he wants us to build something, and he does not understand complicated." "No, he does not." They built a tower. It was lopsided, structurally unsound, and collapsed 3 times before Thomas lost interest and crawled away to investigate a dust ball under the sofa. But for 11 minutes, Cedric and Evelyn sat on the floor of the East Wing sitting room and placed blocks on top of each other while their son watched, and the silence between them was not the silence of anger or punishment or the careful maintenance of emotional distance. It was the silence of 2 people who had destroyed something and were sitting in its wreckage and discovering, with surprise and caution and no guarantee of success, that wreckage could be used as building material if you were willing to start small enough. Samuel found them there when he arrived for Thomas's evening checkup. He stood in the doorway for a moment, observing the scene, the collapsed tower, the scattered blocks, the Duke of Ravenshire sitting cross-legged on the floor with carpet lint on his trousers, the Duchess 3 feet away with a block still in her hand, the boy under the sofa talking to a dust ball in a language that only he understood. Samuel did not say anything. He smiled, a small, private expression that he directed at no one in particular, and then entered the room and picked up Thomas for his examination, and the evening continued with the quiet, imperfect, fundamentally human rhythm of a household that had not yet figured out what it was, but had decided, collectively and without discussion, to keep trying. That night, after Evelyn and Thomas and Samuel had retired to the East Wing, and the manor had settled into its familiar silence, Cedric climbed the stairs to the nursery. He sat in the rocking chair. He took out the photograph of Thomas laughing. Older now, creased and soft from handling, the image slightly faded. He placed it on the windowsill, as he did every night. Then he took out Evelyn's letter, the original letter, written in blood and exhaustion 18 months ago. He unfolded it one final time. The creases were so deep now that the paper had begun to separate along the fold lines, the words fragmenting, breaking apart the way words do when they have been read so many times that they cease to be text and become instead a physical object, a relic, a scar, a record of a wound that was beginning, very slowly, to close. He read the last line. "If our son survives, he will never grow up learning that love looks like abandonment." Cedric folded the letter. He placed it in the drawer of the nursery table, not in his breast pocket, not against his chest. In the drawer where it would remain, read and absorbed and integrated into the structure of who he was and who he was still becoming. The rocking chair moved. The window showed stars. The East Wing was lit, warm yellow light from Evelyn's kitchen, where she was probably making tea while Samuel read, and Thomas slept in a room with dry air and proper heating, and 2 people who loved him standing guard. And on this side of the manor, in the nursery that had once represented everything Cedric had lost, the Duke of Ravenshire sat in the dark and breathed. Not the shallow, controlled breathing of a man managing his image, not the ragged breathing of a man in crisis, just breathing. The simple, involuntary act of drawing air into lungs that worked and releasing it into a room that was no longer empty because it contained, for the first time, a man who had earned the right to be in it. The chair rocked, the stars moved, the night deepened, and the house that had once held nothing but silence began to hold something else. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever, but the thing that comes before forgiveness, the thing that makes forgiveness possible, the thing that a man who has destroyed everything must build before he can build anything else. Presence, the simple, terrifying, ultimately redemptive act of showing up and staying. Cedric rocked in the chair. The photograph caught the starlight, and somewhere in the east wing, his son slept with lungs that were healing. In a house that was learning, beside a mother who had already survived the worst thing love can do to a person and was now, cautiously, discovering what it means to let someone try again. The chair rocked, the night held, the house breathed, and for the first time in the long, ruined, stubbornly continuing life of Duke Cedric Ravenshire, that was enough.